Hello everyone. I'm here to help you today. I know you're using this video to sleep. So before that, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now, sit back and relax. My name is Dr. Iris Ventura, and 6 months ago, I would have told you that maps were the most honest things in the world. Numbers don't lie. Coordinates don't deceive. A topographical survey is just mathematics made visible, the Earth's shape translated into lines and contours that anyone with the proper training can read like a language. I specialized in LiDAR cartography, using laser pulses to create three-dimensional maps of terrain, accurate down to centimeters. My doctoral thesis at the University of Minnesota focused on detecting archaeological sites through micro variations in elevation that human eyes couldn't perceive. I was good at finding things that wanted to stay hidden. The irony isn't lost on me. I'd been working for Meridian Geospatial Solutions for 3 years when Victor Krell walked into our Seattle office on a Tuesday morning in late March. I remember the date because it was the same day my student loan payment bounced for the second time, and I'd been sitting at my desk trying to calculate how many freelance surveys I'd need to take on to make rent. The Pacific Northwest market for cartographers had contracted significantly since the tech layoffs, and Meridian had cut our hours to 30 a week. My apartment in Fremont cost $2,000 a month, and my credit cards were already carrying a balance that made my stomach hurt when I thought about it too long. Victor didn't look like the kind of client who would solve financial problems. He was maybe 65, wearing a canvas jacket that had seen better decades, and carrying a leather portfolio case that was held together with what appeared to be electrical tape. His hair was the color of old snow, tied back in a ponytail that reached between his shoulder blades. When he introduced himself, his handshake was dry and firm, his palm covered in calluses that suggested he spent time working with his hands. "I need a cartographer," he said without preamble, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Someone who can work with incomplete data. Someone who understands that sometimes the most important features on a map are the ones that aren't supposed to be there." I'd heard variations of this pitch before, usually from treasure hunters or conspiracy theorists who wanted me to find buried gold or secret government installations. I'd learned to identify them within the first 5 minutes and politely redirect them to someone else. But something in Victor's delivery made me pause. He wasn't excited or manic. He spoke with the careful precision of someone who had thought through exactly what he needed to say and who understood that his words sounded strange. "What kind of incomplete data are we talking about?" I asked, already composing my gentle refusal. Victor opened his portfolio case and extracted a manila folder, the old-fashioned kind with the metal clasp. Inside were photocopies, dozens of them, Chinese letter in different sizes and qualities. He spread them across my desk with the careful arrangement of someone laying out evidence. "These are cadastral surveys from Catitas County," he said. "Property maps from the county assessor's office, dating from 1923 to present. What do you notice?" I'd looked at thousands of property maps in my career. These appeared standard: section lines, lot numbers, owner names typed or written in various hands depending on their age. Grid patterns showing where roads intersected, where property boundaries divided the earth into legal parcels. I scanned them quickly, looking for whatever Victor wanted me to see. "They're ordinary county surveys," I said. "Nothing unusual about the format or—" "Look at section 14, Township 19 North, Range 17 East," Victor interrupted. tapping one of the older maps with a fingernail. I found the section he indicated. It was a standard square mile, divided into quarter sections as required by the public land survey system that had mapped most of the American West. Roads bordered it on 3 sides. The fourth side, the northern edge, showed what appeared to be a creek or stream, its meandering line breaking the geometric precision of the surveyor's grid. "I see it," I said. "What am I looking for?" "Now look at this one." He slid another map across the desk, dated 1967. Same section. The section looked identical. Same roads, same creek, same property divisions. I started to tell him I still didn't see anything remarkable when I noticed that the orientation was slightly different. Not much, maybe 3 or 4 degrees, but enough that the section appeared to have rotated counterclockwise between 1923 and 1967. "Survey error," I said immediately. "Different surveyors using different equipment, different reference points. It happens, especially with older surveys. The early ones were done with compass and chain, which could introduce significant angular errors over." "Keep looking." Victor was already pulling out more maps. 1982, 1995, 2003, 2018, 2024. I arranged them in chronological order and the pattern became undeniable. The section was rotating, slowly, incrementally, but consistently. By 2024, it had turned nearly 15 degrees counterclockwise from its original orientation. And yet, this was the detail that made my skin prickle. The road still connected properly. The creek still flowed in the same direction relative to the surrounding terrain. The property boundaries still matched up with the adjacent sections, which showed no rotation at all. "This is impossible," I said, which was the wrong thing to say because it implied I was taking the map seriously. "The county assessor's office has records going back to 1889, Victor continued as if I hadn't spoken. "The rotation began in 1923, the year after the original property survey was filed. It's been consistent since then, approximately 0.33 degrees per year. At the current rate, it will complete a full 360-degree rotation in 2187. I pushed the maps back toward him, my hands moving automatically to create distance. "Mr. Krell, this is clearly a surveying error that's been perpetuated through multiple map generations. Someone made a mistake in 1923, and subsequent surveyors copied that mistake without." "I've been to the location," he interrupted again. His eyes, which I noticed for the first time were an unusual gray-green color, held mine without blinking. "The roads exist exactly where the maps say they should. The property boundaries are precisely where the legal descriptions place them. The creek flows where it's indicated. Everything matches the maps perfectly, including the rotation." "That's not possible," I repeated, hearing the edge in my voice. "You can't have a square mile of land rotating while the surrounding terrain remains stationary. It violates basic geometry. It violates physics." "Yes," Victor agreed. "It does. That's why I need a cartographer. Someone who can go there, take measurements with modern equipment, and create a definitive survey that either confirms or disproves what these maps suggest. Someone who can document what's actually happening, whatever that turns out to be." I should have asked him to leave. I should have returned his maps and suggested he contact a licensed surveyor through proper channels. Instead, I heard myself ask, "What's on this section? What's it used for?" "Nothing," Victor said. "It's vacant land." owned by something called the Stillwater Trust, which is registered as a non-profit educational foundation. No buildings, no crops, no grazing. According to county records, it's been vacant since 1923. No one goes there. Why not? Victor's expression shifted slightly, the first change I'd seen in his carefully maintained neutrality. Because people who go there tend to come back confused about directions. Compasses don't work properly in that area. GPS signals are unreliable. The few hikers who have wandered through report feeling disoriented, like they can't quite figure out which way is north. Most people just avoid it after one visit. There's nothing there worth the discomfort. You've been there, I said. It wasn't a question. 7 times, Victor confirmed. I've walked every inch of that section. I've taken photographs, collected soil samples, recorded video, and I've experienced the same disorientation everyone reports. It's not psychological. It's not caused by magnetic anomalies or subsurface formations. It's the land itself, Iris. It's turning, and it's taking everything on it along for the rotation. The use of my first name felt presumptuous, like we'd already moved past the formal stage of our relationship. But I didn't correct him because I was too busy processing what he'd said. 7 visits, photographs, and soil samples. This wasn't an idle curiosity for Victor Krell. This was an obsession, and he was trying to make it mine. Why me? I asked. Why not hire a surveying company with a full team and... Because I've tried that route, Victor said quietly. 3 different firms. They all took the job, took my deposit, and then either returned the money with various excuses or simply stopped returning my calls after visiting the site. One surveyor told me flat out that there was something wrong with the land, and he wasn't going back. Another said his equipment kept malfunctioning and he couldn't get reliable readings. The third just stopped communicating entirely. So you want me because I'm desperate enough to take a job that 3 professional firms have refused. I want you because you're young enough to still believe that the impossible deserves investigation rather than avoidance, Victor replied. And because your financial situation is precarious enough that $15,000 would make a material difference in your life. The number hit me like cold water. $15,000 for a single survey job was far beyond standard rates. It was the kind of money that would clear my credit cards, catch up my student loans, and leave enough for 2 months' rent. It was the kind of money that made you seriously consider things you would otherwise dismiss immediately. That's too much, I said, which was a stupid thing to say but felt necessary. A week-long survey, even in difficult terrain, shouldn't cost more than $5,000 or $6,000. I'm not paying for a week-long survey, Victor said. I'm paying for documentation of something that violates the fundamental assumptions of cartography. I'm paying for your professional reputation to be attached to findings that will make other scientists uncomfortable. And I'm paying for your discretion if you decide that what you find is too strange to publicize. You're paying me to keep quiet if I find something impossible. I'm paying you to document truth, whatever that turns out to be, and then make your own decision about what to do with it. If you want to publish, publish. If you want to file a county report, file it. If you want to tell me I'm insane and that your readings show nothing unusual, I'll accept that conclusion. I just need someone to look properly. Someone with the training and equipment to take accurate measurements and create a map that reflects reality. I picked up one of the more recent surveys, the 2024 version, and studied it carefully. The section showed roads named Stillwater Road and Meridian Cutoff. The creek was labeled as Absence Creek, which seemed like an unusual name. Property ownership was listed as Stillwater Trust, as Victor had said. The surrounding sections showed a mix of farmland and what appeared to be state forest land. Nothing on the map itself suggested anything out of the ordinary, beyond the rotation Victor had pointed out. "When would you need this done?" I asked, still not committing but no longer dismissing. "As soon as possible. I'm 71 years old, Iris. I don't have unlimited time to wait for answers." "You said you've been 7 times. How long have you been investigating this?" 43 years, Victor said, and the weight of those decades sat in the air between us like something physical. "Since 1982, when I was working as a forest ranger and first noticed discrepancies between my topographic maps and what I was seeing on the ground. I've spent most of my retirement trying to understand what's happening to that section of land. I've corresponded with physicists, geologists, cartographers. Most of them ignore me. The few who take me seriously enough to investigate either come back confused or stop responding to my letters." 43 years, I repeated, trying to imagine sustaining any investigation that long. That's a significant portion of your life." "It's been the defining investigation of my life," Victor corrected. "And I'm running out of time to reach any conclusions, so I'm willing to pay more than the job is worth to someone who might actually complete it." I looked at the maps again, at the subtle rotation that became obvious once you knew to look for it. I thought about my overdrawn account, my landlord's increasingly terse emails, the rejection letters from 3 tenure-track positions I'd applied for. I thought about being 34 years old and still living like a graduate student, still unsure whether my career choice had been a mistake. "I'd need to see the site before I commit to anything," I said carefully. "A preliminary visit, no charge, just to assess whether this is even feasible. If I think I can document something useful, then we can discuss terms and timeline." Victor nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. "I can drive you there this weekend. It's about 2 hours east of Seattle, just past Ellensburg. We can leave Saturday morning, walk the perimeter, and be back before dark. I'll need to bring some basic equipment. GPS unit, compass, laser rangefinder. Nothing as sophisticated as a full LiDAR setup, but enough to take some preliminary readings." "Bring whatever you need," Victor said, already gathering his maps. "I'll pick you up at 7 a.m. on Saturday. Where do you live?" I gave him my address, and he wrote it down in a small notebook he extracted from his jacket pocket. His handwriting was precise and slightly old-fashioned, the letters carefully formed as if he'd learned penmanship in an era when such things mattered. "One more question," I said as he stood to leave. "Absence Creek, that's an unusual name. Do you know why it's called that?" Victor paused at my office door. "The early settlers named it. According to local history, it's because the water doesn't come from anywhere. There's no source, no spring, no runoff from higher elevation. It just begins at the northern edge of Section 14, flows south for exactly 1 mile, and then sinks into the ground at the southern edge. No tributaries feeding it, no watershed to explain its existence. It's just water, appearing and disappearing, marking the boundaries of something that doesn't make sense." He left before I could formulate a response to that, and I sat alone in my office, staring at the photocopied maps he'd left scattered across my desk. The fluorescent lights hummed above me, a sound so constant I usually didn't notice it, but in that moment it seemed loud and intrusive, a reminder that I was sitting in a failing geospatial company in a converted warehouse building, surrounded by surveying equipment that was slowly becoming obsolete. I pulled up Google Earth on my computer and entered the coordinates Victor had shown me. Township 19 North, Range 17 East, Section 14. The satellite imagery loaded slowly, my internet connection struggling with the high-resolution files. When it finally appeared, I saw exactly what the maps had depicted. A rough square of land bordered by roads on 3 sides, and what appeared to be a thin line of vegetation on the 4th, presumably following the creek. The land itself showed no obvious features. No buildings, no cleared areas, no trails. Just uniform green-brown terrain that matched the surrounding landscape. I zoomed in as far as the imagery would allow, but the resolution wasn't fine enough to show much detail. The photos appeared to have been taken in summer, based on the vegetation density. I could make out what might have been rocks or boulders scattered across the section, but nothing that suggested human activity or development. On impulse, I checked the metadata for the satellite image. It had been captured on August 14, 2023, by a commercial satellite operated by Maxar Technologies. Standard resolution, no special processing. Nothing unusual about the imagery itself. I pulled up the Catitas County Assessor's website and searched for the parcel. The record confirmed what Victor had told me. 1 square mile owned by the Stillwater Trust, assessed value of $47,000, which seemed low for that much land even if it was undeveloped. No structures listed. No recent sales. The trust had owned it since 1923, according to the ownership history. I searched for information about the Stillwater Trust itself and found almost nothing. No website, no contact information beyond a mailing address in Ellensburg. The Washington State Nonprofit Registry showed it as active, filed in 1922. Mission statement simply reading educational and conservational purposes. No board members listed. No financial records available publicly. The more I searched, the stranger the absence of information seemed. In 2025, almost everything left some kind of digital footprint. Even small nonprofits usually had at least a basic web presence. But the Stillwater Trust existed only as a legal entity on government records, owning a single square mile of land that apparently rotated imperceptibly while doing so. I spent the rest of that Tuesday afternoon trying to focus on actual work, processing LIDAR data for a highway expansion project. But my mind kept returning to Victor's maps. The rotation bothered me not because it was impossible, but because if it was real, it suggested something fundamentally wrong with my understanding of how space worked. Cartography was based on the assumption that the Earth was stable, that coordinates remained fixed even as we measured them more precisely over time. If land could rotate independently of the surrounding terrain, then maps became unreliable, and everything I'd spent years studying became questionable. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in my studio apartment, listening to traffic on Stone Way and trying to think through the logistics of what Victor was proposing. If I took the job, if I actually accepted $15,000 to survey impossible land, what would I do if I found evidence supporting his claims? I'd have to document it properly, create a report that would withstand scrutiny. But who would scrutinize it? Who would take seriously a survey that claimed to have measured rotating terrain? Around 2 a.m., I got up and made tea, then sat at my small kitchen table with my laptop, searching for any academic papers or articles about anomalous surveying results. I found plenty of discussion about surveying errors, magnetic anomalies that affected compass readings, and places where GPS was unreliable due to topography or atmospheric conditions. but I found nothing about land that rotated independently of its surroundings. I did find a few forum posts from hikers who had apparently visited the area near Ellensburg. Most were complaints about getting turned around or losing their sense of direction. One person described feeling like they were walking in circles, even though their GPS track showed a straight line. Another mentioned that their compass had spun lazily, without settling on any particular direction. Several people reported headaches and nausea that cleared up as soon as they left the area. One post from a user named Trail Ghost 47 stood out. Don't go to the land past Meridian Cutoff. I know it looks empty on maps and like it would be good for primitive camping, but there's something wrong with the space there. Not like haunted or scary, just wrong. Like the geometry doesn't add up. I'm an architect. I have a good sense of spatial relationships, and that place made me feel like I was losing my mind. The distances between landmarks kept changing. What should have been a 20-minute walk took either 10 minutes or 40 minutes depending on which direction I approached from. And when I finally found my way back to my car, my GPS said I'd walked 6 miles in a space that should only have been 1 mile across. Not going back. I copied the post into a document I was building, along with the coordinates and Victor's information. If I was going to do this, and I was increasingly certain I was going to do it, because $15,000 represented more financial stability than I'd had in 3 years, then I needed to approach it properly. I needed to document everything, maintain scientific rigor, and be prepared to either confirm or disprove Victor's claims based on empirical evidence. The next 3 days passed in a blur of normal work punctuated by obsessive research into Section 14, Township 19 North, Range 17 East. I requisitioned equipment from Meridian's inventory, a high-precision GPS unit with dual-frequency reception, a surveying-grade total station for measuring distances and angles, a digital compass with automatic declination correction. I also packed my personal gear, laser rangefinder, aluminum survey stakes, rolls of flagging tape, camera with GPS tagging capability. My supervisor, a patient woman named Denise, who had survived 3 rounds of layoffs by being indispensable, asked what I was working on. Private survey job, I told her, which was technically true. Probably nothing, but the client is paying well for preliminary documentation. Be careful with private clients, Denise warned. Sometimes they want you to find specific results rather than accurate results. Don't let anyone pressure you into falsifying data. I won't, I promised and meant it. Whatever I found at Section 14, I would document it honestly. That was the only way to maintain my professional integrity, even if the findings were impossible. Saturday morning arrived with gray skies and the smell of rain. Victor pulled up to my building at exactly 7 a.m. in a mud-spattered Ford pickup that looked about 20 years old. I loaded my equipment into the truck bed, securing everything with bungee cords, then climbed into the passenger seat. "Ready?" Victor asked. I wasn't sure I was, but I nodded anyway. We drove east on I-90, climbing up and over Snoqualmie Pass, then descending into the drier climate of central Washington. Victor drove in silence, focused on the road, and I didn't try to make conversation. I used the time to review my plan for the preliminary survey, walk the perimeter of the section, take GPS readings at each corner, measure angles between the corners using the total station, compare my results to the official survey coordinates. Simple, straightforward, impossible to misinterpret. We exited the highway near Ellensburg and headed north on a state route that cut through rolling hills covered in sagebrush and grass. The landscape here was different from Seattle's evergreen forests, drier, more open, the mountains visible as distant blue shapes on the horizon. We passed through a small town that consisted of a gas station, a post office, and a handful of houses, then continued on increasingly narrow roads. "Almost there," Victor said, as we turned onto a gravel road marked with a weathered sign reading Meridian Cutoff. "Another 3 miles. The road followed a ridge line, offering views of the surrounding terrain. I could see farmland in neat rectangular plots, irrigation systems creating green circles against the brown earth. In the distance, what might have been state forest land covered the higher elevations. And ahead of us, distinguishable only because Victor pointed it out, was a section of land that looked completely unremarkable. "That's it," he said. "Everything between these 2 roads and going north for 1 mile. 1 square mile of something that doesn't make sense." We parked at the intersection of Meridian Cutoff and Stillwater Road, and I climbed out, immediately feeling the wind, cold and steady, carrying the smell of sage and dust. The sky had cleared slightly, patches of blue showing between fast-moving clouds. I could hear nothing but wind and the occasional call of what might have been a hawk or eagle. I walked to where the roads intersected, looking for the survey marker that should indicate the corner of the section. It took me a few minutes to find it, a brass cap set in concrete, weathered but still legible. I photographed it, then took a GPS reading. The coordinates matched the official survey within a few centimeters, well within the margin of error for the equipment. "So far, everything is exactly where it should be," I told Victor. He nodded. "The corners are accurate. It's what happens between them that's strange." I unpacked the total station, a sophisticated piece of surveying equipment that uses a laser to measure distances and angles with extreme precision. Setting it up required leveling the instrument carefully on its tripod, checking the bubble levels, and calibrating it against known points. Victor watched in silence while I worked, his hands in his jacket pockets, his expression unreadable. When everything was ready, I aimed the total station at the southwestern corner of the section, where another survey marker should be located 1 mile away. Through the instrument's eyepiece, I could see the distant terrain, rolling sage-covered hills, a few scattered rocks, and the thin, dark line that must be Absence Creek. But I couldn't see the survey marker, which wasn't surprising given the distance and vegetation. "I'm going to need to walk the perimeter," I told Victor. "Take readings at each corner, measure the distances and angles between them. It'll take most of the day." "I'll come with you," he said immediately. We set off north along Stillwater Road, heading toward the northwestern corner of the section. I kept my GPS unit running continuously, recording our track. Every few hundred feet, I stopped to take a waypoint, noting any features in the landscape, rock outcroppings, changes in vegetation, anything that might serve as a reference point. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not complete silence. The wind still blew, and I could hear our footsteps on the gravel, but an absence of the background sounds I'd grown accustomed to in the outdoors. No bird calls, no insects, no distant traffic noise, just wind and footsteps. The second thing I noticed was that my sense of direction felt unstable. I'm generally good at maintaining spatial awareness, at keeping track of north and south even without a compass. But here, every time I looked away from the road and then looked back, I felt a moment of confusion, like I'd lost track of which way we'd been walking. It wasn't severe, just a persistent low-level disorientation that made me check my GPS more frequently than I normally would. "You're feeling it," Victor said. It wasn't a question. Feeling what? The wrongness. The sense that space isn't quite configured correctly. It gets stronger the farther you go from the roads. He was right. As we walked, the disorientation intensified subtly. My GPS said we'd traveled half a mile north, but it felt like we'd been walking for much longer, or maybe much less. Time and distance seemed to have become slightly decoupled, operating independently of each other in ways that made my head ache when I tried to think about it too carefully. We reached the northwestern corner after what my GPS said was 1 mile, but what felt like either much more or much less. I found the survey marker, another brass cap, identical to the first, and took readings. The coordinates matched the official survey, no discrepancies. From this vantage point, I could see more of the section's interior. The land sloped gently downward toward where Absence Creek must flow, though I couldn't see the water itself from here. The vegetation was consistent: sage, bunch grass, scattered rocks, with no obvious patterns or formations. No buildings, no fences, no signs of human activity except for the survey markers at the corners. "Let's head east," I said, "along the northern boundary." This meant leaving the road and walking across open terrain. I hesitated before stepping off the gravel, suddenly reluctant to move away from the defined path. But Victor was already walking east, following what must be the property line, even though there was no fence or marker to indicate it. I followed, my GPS tracking our path. The ground was rocky and uneven, covered in loose stones that shifted under our feet. After a few hundred yards, I spotted Absence Creek, a thin stream of water flowing south, exactly where the map said it should be. The water was clear and cold when I knelt to touch it, flowing at a moderate pace over a bed of smooth stones. "No source," Victor reminded me. "Walk north for 1,000 feet and you'll find the place where it just begins. Water emerging from dry ground with no spring, no seepage, just starting." I was tempted to do exactly that, to trace the creek to its impossible beginning. But that would have taken us far off course, and I needed to complete the perimeter survey first. I marked the creek's location on my GPS and continued east. The disorientation was definitely worse away from the roads. I found myself constantly checking my compass, which spun slowly but never quite settled on a consistent reading. The GPS track showed us walking in a straight line, but my inner sense of direction insisted we were curving or angling. Several times, I looked back toward the road we'd left and felt a spike of confusion when I couldn't immediately locate it, even though we'd only walked a few hundred yards. "How bad does this get?" I asked Victor. "Depends on how long you stay. An hour or two and you just feel mildly confused. Longer than that and you start to lose track of time. I once spent what I thought was 3 hours walking the section. When I got back to my truck, 7 hours had passed." That doesn't make sense. Time dilation requires significant gravitational or velocity differences. There's no mechanism that could. "I know," Victor interrupted. "I've had the same thoughts. I've brought clocks, synchronized them before entering, checked them after. They show normal time, but my subjective experience is different, and I'm not the only one who's reported it." We reached the northeastern corner marker after another mile, or what my GPS said was another mile. I took readings, photographed the marker, documented the coordinates. Everything matched the official survey. The corners were all exactly where they should be. "Let's break for lunch," Victor suggested. He'd brought sandwiches and water bottles in a small backpack, and we sat on a large, flat rock to eat. From here, I could see back across the section toward the southwest, and for the first time I noticed something strange about the light. The sun was behind clouds, so there shouldn't have been shadows, but the land seemed to have areas of slightly different brightness, subtle variations that created patterns I couldn't quite focus on. When I looked directly at them, they disappeared. When I looked away, I could see them in my peripheral vision. Concentric rings or spirals, maybe, centered somewhere in the middle of the section. "Do you see the patterns?" Victor asked, following my gaze. "I see something. Light variations, maybe. Could be an atmospheric effect or—" "They're always there," Victor said. "Constant rotation, very slow. I've tried to photograph them, but they never show up in pictures. Only visible to direct observation, and even then only if you're not looking straight at them." I finished my sandwich in silence, trying to decide whether I believed what Victor was telling me, or whether I was experiencing some kind of suggestion-induced hallucination. The patterns, if they were real, would have been significant. They would suggest that something was affecting light propagation across the section, bending or distorting it in ways that should require massive gravitational fields or exotic materials. "Let's continue," I said, standing up. I wanted to complete the survey, take all my measurements, and then have time to think about what I'd found without Victor's presence influencing my perceptions. We walked south along the eastern edge of the section, paralleling a road that appeared on the maps as simply Range Road 17E. This edge of the property felt different from the others. The disorientation was less pronounced, and I had an easier time maintaining my sense of direction. My compass still wouldn't settle, but the readings it gave were at least consistent within a 10-degree range rather than spinning randomly. The southern boundary returned us to meridian cutoff, completing the circuit. I'd walked 4 miles, 1 mile on each side of the square, and my GPS track showed exactly that distance. But my legs felt like I'd walked considerably farther, and when I checked my watch, I saw that 6 hours had passed since we'd started, even though 4 miles at a casual walking pace should have taken no more than 2 hours, even accounting for stops to take measurements. "It's 3 p.m., Victor said, checking his own watch. "We should probably head back. You have enough data for your preliminary assessment." I did, or at least I had data. Whether it was enough to make sense of what was happening here, I wasn't certain. I spent the drive back to Seattle reviewing my GPS track, comparing my waypoints to the official survey coordinates, trying to find some discrepancy that would explain the disorientation and time distortion. But everything matched. The section was exactly 1 mile on each side. The corners were precisely where they should be. By every objective measure, Section 14 was a normal square mile of undeveloped land. Except for the rotation that the maps showed, except for the compass that wouldn't work, except for the time that passed faster than it should, except for the creek that flowed from nowhere to nowhere, except for the patterns in the light that disappeared when you looked at them directly. "I'll need to think about this," I told Victor as he dropped me off at my apartment. "Give me a week to process the data and decide whether a full survey would yield useful results." "Take the time you need," Victor said. "But remember, I'm 71. I don't have infinite weeks to wait for decisions." That night, I uploaded all my data to my laptop and spent hours analyzing it, looking for anything that would make sense of what I'd experienced. The GPS tracks were clean, showing exactly 4 miles of walking in a perfect square. The The waypoint coordinates matched the official survey within normal tolerances. The photographs showed unremarkable terrain: sage, rocks, grass, sky. Nothing unusual, nothing impossible. But when I looked at the timestamps on the photographs, I noticed something odd. I'd set my camera to automatically record the time and date for each image. According to the timestamps, I'd taken the first photo at the southwestern corner at 8:47 a.m. The next photo at the northwestern corner was time-stamped 11:23 a.m. That was 2 hours and 36 minutes for a 1-mile walk, which seemed long but not impossible if we'd been moving slowly and stopping frequently. But I remembered that walk taking maybe 45 minutes, and my GPS log showed that we'd covered the mile in approximately 53 minutes, based on when the waypoints were recorded. 3 different timekeeping methods, my memory, my GPS, and my camera, all showing different durations for the same walk. That shouldn't have been possible. The GPS and camera should have been synchronized to atomic clock signals, accurate to within milliseconds. I checked the GPS unit's internal log, looking at the raw satellite data. What I found made my stomach clench. For several periods during our walk along the northern boundary, the stretch farthest from roads, the GPS had lost signal. Not complete loss, but the signal strength had dropped significantly, and the unit had been tracking only 3 or 4 satellites instead of the normal 8 or 9. Reduced satellite visibility could cause inaccurate positioning, but it shouldn't have affected the unit's internal clock, which was independent of GPS reception. Unless something was interfering with time itself, unless the rotation Victor had documented wasn't just affecting space, but also temporal coordinates, unless the section wasn't just turning but was somehow decoupled from the normal flow of causality. I spent the next week doing something I probably shouldn't have done. I searched for academic papers about topological anomalies, space-time distortions, and geographic locations with unusual properties. I found a surprising amount of material, though most of it was published in fringe journals or existed only as preprints that had never been peer-reviewed. There was a paper from a Russian mathematician describing what he called geometric singularities, points where the normal rules of Euclidean space broke down, creating regions where distances and angles didn't sum correctly. He documented 3 such locations in Siberia, all of them remote, and all of them avoided by local populations for reasons they couldn't articulate. His mathematics were elegant, but his empirical evidence was limited to compass readings and subjective reports of disorientation. There was a survey report from New Zealand describing an area where GPS coordinates appeared to shift by small amounts, centimeters to meters, depending on the time of day. The surveyors had dismissed it as equipment malfunction, but their data logs told a different story. The coordinates were genuinely changing, as if the land itself was moving, though no seismic activity had been detected. There was a doctoral thesis from a physicist at Universidad de Buenos Aires who proposed that localized violations of spatial invariance might occur naturally in regions where geological strata created specific crystalline arrangements. She'd calculated that such violations would produce exactly the kinds of effects Victor had described: compass anomalies, time dilation, subjective disorientation. But her thesis had been rejected by her committee, and she'd left academia shortly afterward. I found her name on a patent application for something called topological navigation systems, but couldn't find any evidence that the patent had led to a functional device. The more I read, the more I realized that Section 14 wasn't unique. There were dozens of documented locations around the world where space seemed to misbehave in subtle ways. Most were dismissed as surveying errors or equipment malfunction. A few had been studied briefly before being abandoned due to lack of funding or academic interest. None had been definitively explained. On Thursday afternoon, I called Victor's number. He answered on the second ring. "I'll take the job," I said without preamble, "but I need to modify the terms. 15,000 is generous, but what I'm going to find will either be profound or will make me look like a fool. Either way, I need protection. I want a contract stating that you won't hold me liable for any conclusions I reach, even if they contradict your expectations. And I want permission to publish my findings in whatever form I choose, whether that's an academic paper, a county report, or just a private document for your records." "Agreed," Victor said immediately. "When can you start?" "I need to give Meridian 2 weeks' notice. I'll request a leave of absence rather than resigning outright in case this ends badly. But I can start preliminary work while I'm still employed, reviewing historical surveys, researching the Stillwater Trust, gathering background information. The field work can wait until I'm available full-time. I'll have a contract drawn up, and Iris, thank you for taking this seriously." "I'm taking it seriously because the data warrants it," I said. "Not because I believe anything supernatural is happening. There's a rational explanation for what's going on at that section. I just need to find it." "Of course," Victor agreed, but I could hear the skepticism in his voice. He'd spent 43 years looking for rational explanations and hadn't found any. He didn't believe I would either. I gave Meridian my notice the next day, framing it as a temporary leave to work on an intensive private project. Denise was understanding, though I could see the concern in her eyes. She knew I was barely holding on financially, and she probably assumed I was making a desperate mistake. But she approved the leave anyway, telling me my position would be held for up to 3 months before they'd need to post it as vacant. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. I ordered additional equipment using Victor's advance payment: a ground-penetrating radar unit for subsurface mapping, a magnetometer for detecting magnetic anomalies, a seismograph for monitoring any ground motion. I also bought a high-end action camera with GPS integration and time-lapse capability, thinking that if the rotation was real, continuous video documentation might capture it. I researched the history of Section 14 as thoroughly as I could with limited records. The land had been surveyed in 1889 as part of the original federal land grant surveys that divided the western United States into the grid system we still used. The surveyor's notes for that original work were archived at the Washington State Historical Society, and I made a trip to Tacoma to review them. The surveyor, a man named Clarence Denholm, had noted the section as flat terrain, suitable for agriculture, watered by spring-fed creek of unknown origin. He'd planted the corner markers in July 1889 and moved on to the next township without any indication that he'd encountered anything unusual. The property had been claimed in 1890 by a homesteader named William Thatcher, who'd filed for ownership under the Homestead Act. But Thatcher never completed the requirements for ownership. According to county records, he'd abandoned the claim in 1892 without explanation. The land had reverted to federal ownership and remained unclaimed until 1922, when the Stillwater Trust had purchased it from the government for $100. I tried to trace the Stillwater Trust's origins but found almost nothing. It had been incorporated in November 1922 by 3 individuals whose names appeared on the incorporation documents: Dr. Helena Voss, Professor James Mordecai, and Ms. Catherine Ingram. I searched for these names in historical records and found sparse information. Helena Voss had been a physician in Ellensburg, associated with the county hospital. James Mordecai had taught mathematics at what was then Washington State College. Catherine Ingram was more elusive. I found only a single reference to her in a 1921 newspaper article about a lecture series on natural philosophy, sponsored by a women's educational society. All 3 had died by 1940, according to county death records. But the Stillwater Trust had continued to exist. Its ownership of Section 14 never transferred or relinquished. The Trust's registered address changed several times over the decades, always to post office boxes in various eastern Washington towns. The current address was a P.O. box in Ellensburg, which I confirmed was still active when I called the post office, though they wouldn't tell me who collected the mail. On my last day at Meridian, Denise pulled me aside. "Iris, I'm worried about you," she said bluntly. "This private client, this feels wrong. You're too smart to waste 3 months on something that sounds like a treasure hunt or a conspiracy theory." "It's legitimate surveying work," I assured her. "Strange circumstances, yes, but the methodology is solid. I'm just documenting what's actually there, whatever that turns out to be. And if what's actually there doesn't match what your client wants to find, then I document that," I said. "Look, I know this seems odd, but the money is real, the site exists, and at worst I'll spend 3 months doing field work that might not lead anywhere. That's not so different from academic research, right? Most experiments fail to prove their hypotheses. Most experiments don't require you to take a leave of absence from a secure job," Denise pointed out. But she didn't push further, just gave me a hug and made me promise to check in weekly. I started the full survey on Monday, June 2nd. Victor met me at the site at dawn, helping me unload my equipment from the rented cargo van I'd driven from Seattle. I'd packed enough gear to stay on site for extended periods: camping equipment, food supplies, water filtration, first aid kit, satellite phone for emergencies. I planned to spend at least a week doing continuous measurements, documenting any changes that occurred over multiple day-night cycles. We set up a base camp at the southwestern corner, just off Meridian Cutoff, where my van could be parked safely. I pitched a heavy-duty tent designed for severe weather, set up a folding table for my laptop and equipment, and established a generator-powered charging station for batteries and devices. "I'll leave you to it," Victor said once everything was arranged, "unless you want company." "I work better alone," I told him, which was true. "I'll call you on the satellite phone if I need anything or if I find something significant. Otherwise, plan to come back in 7 days." He nodded, understanding. "Be careful, Iris. The disorientation gets worse the longer you're here. Don't try to push through it if you start feeling seriously affected. Better to take breaks, leave the section periodically to clear your head." "I will," I promised, though I wasn't sure I meant it. The scientific method required sustained observation, and I couldn't document time-dependent phenomena if I kept leaving the observation area. Victor drove away, and I was alone with 1 square mile of impossible land. I started with what I called the baseline survey, a complete mapping of the section using multiple overlapping methods. I set up the total station at the southwestern corner and began taking distance and angle measurements to every visible landmark I could identify. Rocks, vegetation clusters, subtle terrain variations, anything that could serve as a reference point. I marked each measured location with a numbered flag, creating a network of identified positions that I could resurvey later to detect any movement. This process took most of the first day. By evening, I had measured and flagged 47 distinct locations spread across the section. I also set up the seismograph in what I judged to be the approximate center of the section, about half a mile from each corner. The device would continuously monitor ground vibration, recording any seismic activity or motion that might explain the rotation Victor claimed was occurring. That first night, I slept poorly. The tent blocked the wind but couldn't block the silence, which was so complete it felt oppressive. I kept waking, thinking I'd heard something, only to realize the sound was just my own breathing or the rustle of my sleeping bag. At some point around 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and instead set up the magnetometer to take readings in a grid pattern. The magnetic field data was immediately wrong. Not wrong like equipment malfunction. I tested the magnetometer thoroughly before coming, but wrong like the field itself wasn't behaving as it should. In a normal location, the Earth's magnetic field is relatively uniform, varying smoothly with only small local perturbations from subsurface metal deposits or geological features. Here, the field showed strange patterns, not random, but structured, as if something was organizing the magnetic flux into geometric arrangements. I mapped the field intensity across a 100-meter grid, taking readings every 5 meters. When I plotted the results, I saw concentric circles centered on a point approximately 100 meters north of the seismograph. The magnetic field strength increased toward this center point, peaking at about 60,000 nanoteslas, roughly 20% higher than Earth's normal background field. And the direction of the field rotated as you moved closer to the center, spiraling inward like water circling a drain. This wasn't natural. Magnetic anomalies from geological formations created local variations, but they didn't create spiral patterns with such perfect symmetry. This looked engineered, though I couldn't imagine what kind of engineering could create a stable spiral magnetic field over such a large area. I spent Tuesday morning expanding the magnetic survey, mapping a larger area to see how far the anomaly extended. The spiral pattern persisted across the entire section, though it was stronger in the northern half near Absence Creek. At the section's boundaries, where the roads marked the edges, the field abruptly returned to normal background levels, as if there were an invisible wall containing the anomaly. Tuesday afternoon, I hiked to the center point that the magnetic data had identified. It took me longer than it should have. My GPS said the distance was 500 meters, but the walk felt like several miles, and I had to stop multiple times when the disorientation became overwhelming. The sense that directions were wrong intensified the closer I got to the center, until I found myself pausing after every 20 or 30 steps to verify my heading. When I finally reached the coordinates I was aiming for, I found nothing remarkable. The center of the magnetic anomaly was just another patch of sage-covered ground, indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain. No rocks, no unusual vegetation, no visible features that would explain why this spot was special. But when I stood there, I felt it, a sensation I couldn't quite name, like pressure or presence or potential. The air tasted different, metallic and sharp. My inner ear reported that I was moving even though I was standing still, a sensation similar to being on a boat in rough water. And when I looked at the horizon, I couldn't quite make the landscape form a coherent picture. The hills in the distance seemed to be in slightly wrong positions, as if they'd shifted when I wasn't looking. I set up the ground-penetrating radar at the center point, configuring it to scan in a radial pattern out to a depth of 10 meters. The GPR sends radio waves into the ground and analyzes the reflections to create a cross-sectional image of subsurface structures. It's normally used to find buried utilities, archaeological features, or geological layers. What the GPR showed me wasn't any of those things. The subsurface structure was organized. Layers of rock and soil that formed geometric patterns, hexagons or perhaps pentagons, too regular to be natural formations. The patterns extended down to the GPR's maximum range, suggesting they continued deeper still. And at the very center, directly beneath where I was standing, there was a void, a space where the GPR detected no reflections at all, as if there was simply nothing there to reflect the radio waves. A void 5 meters in diameter, starting 2 meters below the surface and extending down beyond what I could measure. I spent an hour checking and rechecking the GPR results, certain I must be misinterpreting the data. But the void remained consistent across multiple scan orientations and frequencies. There was definitely something hollow beneath me, either a natural cave or chamber, or something artificial that had been placed or built there. Define placed, I muttered to myself, standing over what might be an underground cavity in the middle of nowhere. Who would have dug a chamber here? The Stillwater Trust when they acquired the land, the original homesteader before he abandoned his claim, some earlier occupant whose presence hadn't been recorded in historical documents. Or, and this was the thought that made my skin prickle, what if the void wasn't created by human activity? What if it was a natural feature that had always been there, and the strange properties of the section were somehow related to this underground anomaly? I marked the location with a large cairn of rock so I could find it again easily, then hiked back to base camp. The return trip was worse than the outward journey. Twice, I had to sit down when the disorientation became so severe I wasn't sure which direction I was facing. My GPS track showed me walking in a straight line back toward camp, but my subjective experience was of walking in circles or spirals, never quite getting closer to my destination. When I finally reached the tent, I was trembling with exhaustion and something close to fear. I'd been in difficult field conditions before, isolated locations, extreme weather, technical challenges with equipment, but I'd never experienced anything that affected my perception so profoundly. The section wasn't just confusing, it was actively undermining my ability to trust my own senses. I forced myself to eat dinner, freeze-dried camping food that tasted like cardboard but provided calories and nutrients, and then reviewed the day's data on my laptop. The magnetic anomaly, the subsurface void, the geometric patterns in the GPR images. None of it made sense individually, and it made even less sense taken together. But there was a pattern emerging, a suggestion of structure. The section wasn't just land that happened to have unusual properties. It was land that had been modified or was being modified, shaped into something with intentional geometry. The rotation Victor had documented, the spiral magnetic field, the organized subsurface formations, they all suggested purposeful arrangement rather than random natural variation. Which raised the obvious question, purposeful arrangement by whom or what? I slept slightly better Tuesday night, exhaustion overriding my unease about the oppressive silence. But I woke abruptly at 2:47 a.m., the exact time recorded by my watch, with the certainty that something had changed. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening, trying to identify what had triggered my awareness. The silence had shifted quality. It was no longer just an absence of sound, but something more active, like silence that was listening. I know how irrational that sounds, but there was a difference between empty quiet and expectant quiet, and what surrounded my tent felt expectant. I unzipped the tent flap and looked outside. The night was clear, stars brilliant against the black sky. The moon hadn't risen yet, so the only light came from my tent's LED lantern and the distant glow of Ellensburg on the southern horizon. Nothing was moving. Nothing was visible that shouldn't be there. But the air tasted wrong again. That same metallic sharpness I'd noticed at the center point, now present here at the camp. And when I looked north toward the interior of the section, I could see them clearly for the first time. The patterns in the light that Victor had described, visible now as faint luminescent spirals turning slowly against the darkness. They weren't reflected light or atmospheric phenomena. They were generating their own faint glow, a blue-white phosphorescence that pulsed slowly, brightening and dimming in a rhythm that might have been regular, but was too slow for me to time accurately. The spirals rotated counterclockwise, the same direction as the section's rotation in the historical maps, completing what looked like one full turn every few minutes. I grabbed my camera and took dozens of long-exposure photographs, hoping to capture what my eyes were seeing. The patterns were still there when I looked away and back, still visible when I closed my eyes and opened them. Real then, or at least real enough that my visual cortex was interpreting them consistently. I watched the spirals until my neck ached from looking upward at an angle, trying to determine if they were at ground level or elevated, if they were two-dimensional or had depth. They seemed to exist at multiple heights simultaneously, or perhaps to connect ground and sky in ways that made depth ambiguous. The center was definitely over the location where my GPR had found the subsurface void. Around 4 a.m., the spirals began to fade, their luminescence dimming until they were barely visible. By 4:30, they disappeared completely, and the normal dark silence had returned. I went back into my tent and tried to sleep, but my mind was racing with implications. The patterns were real, not psychological suggestion, not equipment artifacts, but actual observable phenomena that persisted over time and could presumably be photographed. Whatever was happening at Section 14 wasn't just affecting navigation or perception. It was generating visible energy in organized patterns. That required a source, a mechanism, and probably a purpose. Wednesday morning, I reviewed my photographs from the night. I'd expected them to show nothing, or at best some vague light anomalies that could be dismissed as lens flare or atmospheric effects. Instead, I saw exactly what I'd observed: spiral patterns of luminescence, clearly defined and geometrically precise. The long exposures had captured them beautifully, showing their rotation and the way they pulsed with brightness. I spent Wednesday setting up the time-lapse camera system. I positioned 3 cameras at different points around the section's perimeter, each aimed toward the center point. They were programmed to take one photograph every 30 seconds continuously, storing the images to high-capacity memory cards. If the rotation was real, if the land was actually turning, then time-lapse photography over multiple days should reveal it. I also set up the continuous GPS monitoring system. I placed GPS receivers at each of the 4 corners and at the center point, programming them to record their positions once per second. If the section was rotating, The GPS coordinates of the interior points should shift relative to the corners, which were anchored to the surrounding stable ground. These systems would run autonomously, gathering data whether I was present or not. I could leave the section for breaks, to shower in Ellensburg, to buy supplies, to give my brain time to process in normal space, and the equipment would keep recording. But I didn't leave. Something kept me there, some combination of scientific curiosity and growing obsession. I needed to understand what was happening, needed to see if the patterns would appear again, needed to know if my measurements would confirm or refute Victor's claims about rotation. Wednesday afternoon, I hiked to the northern boundary where Absence Creek marked the edge of the section. The creek was about 6 feet wide, flowing south at a moderate pace. The water was cold and clear, revealing a bottom of smooth stones that had been worn round by millennia of current. I followed the creek northward, walking along its bank, watching for the source that Victor had said didn't exist. The stream maintained constant width and flow rate as I walked, showing no signs of diminishing as it should if I were approaching its headwaters. After about 1,000 feet, the distance Victor had mentioned, the creek simply began. There was no spring, no seepage from underground. The water emerged from dry ground, welling up between rocks as if the earth itself was generating it. The soil immediately around the starting point was damp, but there was no elevated water table, no logical source that would explain the flow. The creek just started, as impossible as everything else about this section. I took water samples, measured the flow rate, tested the temperature and pH. The water was unremarkable, slightly alkaline, low mineral content, temperature consistent with groundwater in this region. Nothing unusual about the water itself, just its origin. I also noticed something else. My disorientation was less severe near the creek. Walking along its bank, I had a clearer sense of direction than I did inland. The water seemed to provide a reference point that helped stabilize my perception, as if its flow gave me something constant to orient by. I spent the rest of Wednesday walking the creek's entire length from source to where it sank into the ground at the southern boundary. The whole trip took about 90 minutes at a casual pace, and the disorientation remained tolerable the entire time. When I reached the southern end, where the water vanished into the earth as impossibly as it appeared in the north, I marked the location and took more measurements. The creek flowed south. That meant it flowed against the section's rotation, if Victor's maps were accurate. Water moving counterclockwise while the land turned counterclockwise would create relative motion, the water effectively stationary while the land rotated beneath it. Or perhaps the water was the only stationary element, the one constant feature while everything else moved around it. Perhaps the creek existed to mark the rotation, to make visible something that would otherwise be imperceptible. I was starting to think like Victor, I realized. Starting to accept that impossible things might be happening rather than searching for rational explanations. That was dangerous. That was how scientists stopped being scientists and became believers in phenomena they couldn't prove. But the data was accumulating. The magnetic anomaly, the subsurface void, the luminescent spirals, the creek from nowhere, the disorientation that got worse away from fixed references, the time discrepancies between my watch and my GPS. All of it pointed toward something profoundly wrong with this section of land, something that violated basic assumptions about how space and time function. Wednesday night, the spirals appeared again at 2:47 a.m. exactly the same time as the previous night. I was awake and waiting, having set an alarm for 2:30 a.m. I watched them materialize gradually, starting as faint hints of light and growing brighter over 10 or 15 minutes until they reached full visibility. This time, I was prepared with instruments. I had the magnetometer positioned at the center point, recording field strength continuously. I had a radio receiver tuned to multiple frequencies, listening for any electromagnetic emissions. I had my video camera on a tripod, recording the spiral's appearance and motion. The magnetometer showed the spiral pattern intensifying as the visible spirals appeared, the field strength increasing by another 10%. The radio receiver picked up faint signals across a broad spectrum, not communication or broadcast, but something like static or noise organized into patterns. When I recorded it and analyzed the audio later, I found recurring frequencies that corresponded to the visual spiral's rotation rate. The spirals were definitely real then, not just visual phenomena, but accompanied by measurable magnetic and electromagnetic effects. They were some kind of energy manifestation, though I couldn't identify the energy source or mechanism. I watched them until they faded at 4:30 a.m., exactly 2 hours after they'd appeared, and then spent the rest of the night analyzing the data. The patterns were consistent with rotational phenomena. The magnetic field spiraled inward. The electromagnetic emissions showed frequency modulation that suggested circular motion. The visual spirals rotated at approximately 1 revolution per 3 minutes. Everything was turning, all of it in the same direction, all of it at slightly different rates, but maintaining phase relationships that suggested they were aspects of a single underlying rotation. Thursday morning, I checked the GPS data from the corner markers and center point. I'd expected to see the center point shifting position relative to the corners, rotating slowly over the 3 days I'd been recording. What I actually saw was more subtle and more disturbing. The GPS coordinates weren't shifting in simple rotation. Instead, they were oscillating, moving in small elliptical paths maybe 20 or 30 centimeters across, completing one ellipse every 24 hours. The corners showed the same oscillation, but out of phase with each other and with the center point, creating a complex pattern of relative motion that looked almost organic, like the breathing or pulse of something alive. I plotted the motion vectors, creating a visualization that showed how each point moved over time. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. The oscillations combined to create a slow rotation, with the center point spiraling gradually counterclockwise, while the corners constrained the motion to stay within the section's boundaries. The land was turning, not dramatically, not at a rate that would be visible to casual observation, but measurably, documentably turning at approximately 1/3 of a degree per year, just as Victor's maps had shown. I sat in my tent Thursday morning, staring at the GPS data visualization on my laptop, trying to comprehend what I'd proven. The impossible was real. Land was rotating independently of its surroundings, violating conservation of angular momentum and any reasonable understanding of geophysics. And I'd measured it. I documented it with instruments that showed exactly what was happening, which meant I needed to figure out why it was happening and what was causing it. The obvious connection was the subsurface void, something below ground, natural or artificial, that was generating or focusing the rotational energy. I needed to access that void to see what was inside it, to understand its relationship to the phenomena I was measuring. but the void was 2 meters underground. Excavating it would require equipment I didn't have and permits I hadn't obtained. I could use more extensive ground-penetrating radar to map it better, but that wouldn't tell me what it contained or how it functioned, unless I could find another way in. I spent Thursday afternoon doing a more thorough GPR survey of the entire section, looking for any surface openings or structural weaknesses that might provide access to the void. The hexagonal patterns I'd seen earlier extended across most of the section's northern half, all of them oriented toward the central void like flower petals around a center. And in one location, about 50 meters west of the center point, I found what might have been an entrance. The GPR showed a vertical shaft, roughly circular, descending from the surface down to intersect with the void at a depth of 4 meters. The shaft was narrow, maybe a meter in diameter, and appeared to be either natural, a cave opening, or very old construction, a hand-dug well. I hiked to the coordinates and found it hidden beneath an outcropping of rock and heavy sage brush. If I hadn't been looking specifically for it based on the GPR data, I never would have noticed it. Just a dark circular opening in the ground, partially obscured by vegetation, with no obvious trail or markers to indicate anyone had ever used it. I cleared away the brush and examined the opening. It was definitely artificial. The sides were too regular, the stones around the rim too carefully placed. An old well shaft, maybe, or some kind of access tunnel. The darkness below was absolute, my flashlight beam revealing weathered stone sides that descended straight down beyond where I could see. I should have called Victor. I should have documented my findings and consulted with someone who had more experience with underground exploration. I should have at minimum informed someone where I was going so that if something went wrong, there would be a record of my last known location. Instead, I went back to camp, gathered my climbing harness and rope, tested my flashlights, and returned to the shaft opening before I could talk myself out of it. The descent took longer than I expected. The shaft went down 4 meters, the depth the GPR had indicated, but descending on rope in the dark, unable to see what I was lowering myself toward, made every meter feel like 10. The walls were definitely human construction, stones fitted together without mortar, the craftsmanship suggesting age and skill. At the bottom, my feet touched solid rock. I unclipped from the rope and swept my flashlight around, revealing a chamber roughly circular, maybe 8 meters across, with a ceiling high enough that I could stand comfortably. The walls were the same carefully fitted stone as the shaft, and the floor was smooth rock that had been worked flat. And in the center of the chamber stood a stone pillar, about 2 meters tall and perhaps half a meter in diameter, carved with symbols or writing that I didn't recognize. The style wasn't Native American, wasn't European, wasn't any writing system I'd encountered in my studies of historical cartography and surveying. The characters were geometric circles, spirals, interlocking angular patterns, arranged in vertical columns that wound around the pillar's circumference. I approached cautiously, my footsteps echoing in the enclosed space. The air here was cold and absolutely still, with no circulation, no sense of connection to the surface beyond the shaft I'd descended. The chamber felt sealed, isolated, existing in its own envelope of space distinct from the world above. The pillar's surface was smooth, the carvings deep and precise. I traced one of the spiral patterns with my finger, feeling the groove worn into the stone. Not worn by weather or erosion. We were underground, protected from the elements. but worn as if by countless hands touching the same pattern over long years. As I touched the carving, something changed. The air pressure shifted, or maybe my inner ear reported motion that my body couldn't feel. The silence became more complete, more absolute, and the patterns on the pillar, the carved spirals and circles, began to emit faint light, the same blue-white phosphorescence I'd seen in the nighttime spirals above ground. The light grew brighter, pulsing slowly, and I realized the patterns on the pillar matched the magnetic field patterns I'd mapped. The spirals carved in stone corresponded to the spirals in the magnetic field, and both corresponded to the luminescent patterns that appeared each night. This pillar was somehow generating or controlling all of it: the rotation, the magnetic anomaly, the light patterns. It was a machine, or something like a machine, an artifact of unknown origin and impossible function, buried beneath a square mile of land in central Washington, turning the ground above it at 1/3 of a degree per year. I should have been terrified. I should have climbed back up the shaft immediately, documented what I'd found, and brought in experts to figure out what this thing was. But instead, I felt a strange calm, almost recognition, as if some part of me had known all along that something like this must exist beneath the surface. I spent perhaps an hour in the chamber, photographing the pillar from every angle, taking measurements, trying to document its dimensions and features with the equipment I'd brought. The pillar stood on a circular base that seemed to be part of the underlying bedrock, as if it had grown from the stone rather than being placed there. The carvings covered its entire surface, spiraling from base to top in patterns that might have been mathematical notations or might have been purely decorative. The phosphorescent glow continued the entire time I was present, pulsing at the same slow rate as the surface spirals. When I held my compass near the pillar, the needle spun freely, unable to find north. When I checked my GPS unit, it showed my coordinates jumping randomly within a radius of several hundred meters, as if it couldn't determine my actual position. I climbed back up the shaft as carefully as I descended, emerging into daylight that seemed harsh after the chamber's blue-white glow. My watch showed that I'd been underground for 93 minutes, though it had felt like much less. More time distortion then, more evidence that the normal flow of causality didn't apply here. I covered the shaft opening again, marking its location but concealing it from casual discovery. Then I hiked back to camp, my mind full of questions I had no idea how to answer. That evening, I called Victor on the satellite phone. "I found it," I said without preamble when he answered. "The source. There's a stone pillar in an underground chamber, covered in symbols, and it's generating everything. The rotation, the magnetic patterns, all of it." Victor was silent for a long moment. "Describe it," he said finally. I did, giving him every detail I could remember. The shaft's location, the chamber's dimensions, the pillar's appearance, and the light it emitted. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he was quiet again. "Helena found something similar," he said eventually. "Not identical, but similar. That's what the Stillwater Trust was created to study." "Helena Voss, one of the founders." "Yes. She was a physician, but her real interest was natural philosophy, what we'd call physics now. She believed there were locations where the normal rules broke down, where space and time became malleable. She spent years looking for evidence, and in 1922 she found this section, found something that convinced her she was right. The pillar. I don't know exactly what she found. The Trust's original documents are lost or sealed. but she convinced two colleagues to help her establish the trust and acquire the land. They studied it for years, kept detailed records, and then they all died. Helena in 1937, James in 1938, Catherine in 1940. None of them published their findings. The trust continued under new management, but whoever took over seemed more interested in protecting the site than studying it. Protecting it from what? From people who might misuse it, from scientists who might try to exploit it, from the government maybe, if they decided this was something that needed to be controlled or weaponized. The trust has owned the land for a century now, paying property taxes, maintaining the boundaries, keeping people away without being obvious about it. And you, how did you get involved? I stumbled onto it like I told you, but after I started asking questions, someone from the trust contacted me. Anonymous letters warning me to stop investigating, offering me money to go away. I didn't stop, but I did become more careful. I've been tolerated, I think, because I'm old and harmless and unlikely to make the kind of breakthrough that would expose the site publicly. Until you hired me. Until I hired you, Victor agreed. Someone with credentials and equipment and the training to document things properly. Someone who might actually figure out what Helena Voss discovered a century ago. I stood outside my tent, looking north toward where the pillar waited beneath the earth. What do you want me to do with this, Victor? If I document everything I've found, if I create maps and reports and proof, what happens then? That's your decision, Iris. I can't tell you what to do with truth. I can only tell you that it exists and that someone needs to acknowledge it. We talked for another 20 minutes, Victor sharing what little he knew about Helena Voss's work and the trust's history. When we hung up, I felt more isolated than I had before the call. I was sitting on one of the most significant discoveries in human history. Physical proof that space-time could be manipulated locally, that rotation could occur without external torque, that something or someone had built a machine that violated fundamental physics, and I had no idea what to do about it. The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of measurements, documentation, and growing unease. I descended into the chamber twice more, each time spending longer periods examining the pillar and trying to understand its function. The symbols resisted interpretation. I photographed every inch of the surface and ran the images through every translation database and pattern recognition software I could access, but nothing matched. The writing system, if that's what it was, had no known parallel in human history. On my second descent, I brought the magnetometer into the chamber and took detailed readings around the pillar. The magnetic field formed a torus shape, spiraling up from the base and curving back down at the top, creating a self-contained loop that extended beyond the chamber walls into the surrounding rock. The field strength at the pillar's surface peaked at nearly 200,000 nanoteslas, more than 3 times Earth's normal background field. That kind of magnetic field should have required either a powerful electromagnet or a substantial deposit of magnetized rock. The pillar was neither. It was carved stone, probably limestone or sandstone based on the color and texture, with no metallic content that would explain the magnetic properties. On my third descent, I stayed for nearly 4 hours, watching the pillar's light pulse, trying to detect any pattern or variation in its behavior. The glow remained constant in intensity and rhythm, brightening and dimming with metronomic precision, about 30-second intervals between peaks. I timed it against my watch and found no variation over the entire observation period. Whatever powered this thing had been running at exactly the same rate for however long it had existed. And that raised perhaps the most disturbing question. How long had it existed? The chamber's stonework suggested significant age, centuries at minimum, possibly millennia. The erosion patterns on the pillar's base indicated it had been standing for a very long time, though underground preservation made dating difficult. Helena Voss had discovered it in 1922, but it had obviously existed long before that. The homesteader William Thatcher had likely encountered it in the 1890s, which might explain why he'd abandoned his claim. The original surveyor Clarence Denholm had noted the creek's unknown origin in 1889, but hadn't mentioned anything about the rotation or magnetic anomalies. Perhaps he'd completed his work quickly and left before experiencing the full effects. How far back did it go? Had native peoples known about this place? The historical record for this region was sparse before European contact, but there were oral traditions that spoke of places where the spirits were too strong, where the land itself was alive in ways that made it dangerous to visit. Was Section 14 one of those places? Had it been rotating for centuries or millennia before Western surveyors mapped it into their grid? Or, and this thought made my hands shake when I let myself consider it, was the pillar even human in origin? The symbols didn't match any known writing system. The engineering exceeded anything I understood to be possible. The age could have been far greater than human civilization in the Americas. I didn't want to think that way. I'd studied enough to know that humans consistently underestimated the capabilities of ancient peoples, attributing sophisticated engineering to aliens or lost civilizations, when in fact various human cultures had developed remarkable technologies. But this felt different. This felt like something that couldn't have been human creation, not because it was too advanced, but because it was too alien. The geometry was wrong in ways I couldn't articulate, the proportions slightly off from what human hands would naturally create. By Friday evening, I'd accumulated more data than I knew what to do with. GPS logs showing the oscillating rotation, magnetic field maps depicting the spiral patterns, ground-penetrating radar images revealing the hexagonal subsurface structures, photographs of the luminescent spirals that appeared each night, video footage of the pillar and its pulsing glow, water samples from the impossible creek, seismograph recordings showing the ground's subtle but constant vibration at frequencies that matched the pillar's light pulse. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Section 14 was rotating because something beneath it was causing that rotation, and that something was the pillar I'd found in the underground chamber. But I still didn't understand why. What was the purpose of making land rotate? What did the rotation accomplish? Was it generating energy or consuming it? Was it part of a larger system or a standalone mechanism? And most importantly, was it stable or was it building towards some kind of threshold or limit? The rotation rate had been constant for a century according to Victor's maps. But what if it was accelerating imperceptibly? What if the 1/3 degree per year was just the current rate, and decades or centuries from now, it would be spinning fast enough to be dangerous? What if the pillar was counting down to something, and the symbols on its surface were a warning or instruction we couldn't read? I called Victor again on Saturday morning. I need to bring other people in, I told him. This is beyond what I can analyze alone. I need geologists, physicists, archaeologists, specialists who might be able to interpret the symbols or understand the mechanism. No, Victor said immediately. Not yet. Document everything first, create a complete record, and then decide who to tell and how to tell them. But if you bring people in now, while you're still gathering data, this stops being your discovery. It becomes a government project or a university research site, and you lose control of the findings. I don't want control, I want understanding. You can have both, but you need to be strategic. Finish your survey, complete your documentation, then present it as a finished analysis rather than an ongoing investigation. That way you maintain scientific authority and can shape how the information is released. He was right, I knew. Academic politics and funding priorities would determine who got access to the site and what kinds of research were prioritized. If I came forward with incomplete data and active questions, I'd be sidelined in favor of senior researchers with better credentials and institutional backing. One more week, I conceded. I'll finish the time-lapse photography, complete the GPS monitoring, and do one final chamber survey. Then I'll compile everything into a comprehensive report. Good, and Iris, be careful. The trust has stayed quiet so far, but if they realize you found the chamber, they might intervene. Intervene how? I don't know. I've never pushed far enough to find out. But they've protected this site for a century. They won't stop just because we've discovered what they've been hiding. After we hung up, I spent Saturday reviewing my time-lapse footage. The 3 cameras I'd positioned around the section's perimeter had been running continuously for 5 days, capturing one frame every 30 seconds. When I stitched the frames together into videos and played them back at accelerated speed, I could see it, the subtle rotation of the terrain relative to the fixed camera positions. It was barely perceptible even in time-lapse, just a slow counterclockwise drift of landmarks over multiple days. But it was real. The rocks and vegetation I'd used as reference points were shifting position, rotating around the center point where the pillar waited beneath the earth. At the current rate, extrapolating from 5 days of footage, the section would complete a full rotation in approximately 1,087 years, slightly faster than the historical maps had suggested, but within the margin of uncertainty, which meant the rotation was either accelerating slowly, or my measurements were more precise than the historical surveys, or both. Saturday night, I watched the luminescent spirals appear again at 2:47 a.m. They'd been consistent every night since I'd started observing them. But this time, I noticed something new. The spirals weren't just rotating, they were also precessing, their angle of tilt shifting slowly over time. It was subtle enough that I hadn't caught it in previous observations, but with multiple nights of video footage to compare, the precession was clear. The spirals were tilting gradually from vertical toward horizontal, changing their angle by perhaps a degree or 2 per night. If that rate continued, they'd be completely horizontal, parallel to the ground, within a few months. And I had no idea what that meant or what would happen when they reached that orientation. Was it part of the pillar's normal cycle, a response to some external stimulus, or a sign that something was changing, that the system was transitioning into a different state? I spent most of Sunday trying to detect any other changes in the section's behavior. The magnetic field strength seemed stable. The GPS oscillations continued at the same amplitude and frequency. The seismograph showed no increase in vibration intensity. Everything appeared to be maintaining steady state, except for the spiral's slowly changing angle. Sunday afternoon, I made my 4th descent into the chamber. This time, I brought a laser level to measure the pillar's verticality, wanting to see if it was tilting in the same way the light spirals were. The level showed the pillar was perfectly vertical, aligned with true gravitational down to within 1/100th of a degree. No tilt, no lean, no deviation from perfect upright orientation. So the spiral's precession wasn't reflecting any physical change in the pillar itself. The light patterns were behaving independently of their source, which suggested they were something more than just visual phenomena. They were manifestations of forces or fields that existed separately from the pillar's physical structure. I also noticed on this fourth visit that the chamber felt different. The air pressure seemed lower or maybe thicker. I couldn't quite identify the sensation, but breathing required slightly more effort than it should. And the silence had become more profound, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, hear the blood moving through the vessels in my ears. When I emerged from the shaft after 3 hours underground, the surface world seemed almost unbearably loud and bright. The wind had picked up, and the sound of it through the sage brush was jarring after the chamber's absolute quiet. I had to sit for several minutes, letting my senses readjust, before I could make the hike back to camp. That evening, I reviewed all my data systematically, looking for patterns or connections I might have missed. The magnetic field spiraled inward toward the pillar. The GPS coordinates oscillated in phase with the magnetic pulses. The luminescent spirals appeared at the same time each night and rotated at a rate that matched the land's rotation when scaled appropriately. The hexagonal subsurface structures all pointed toward the central chamber. Everything was connected, all aspects of a single integrated system. The pillar wasn't just causing the rotation, it was orchestrating a complex set of phenomena that affected magnetism, light, space-time geometry, and possibly other variables I hadn't thought to measure. I pulled up my photographs of the pillar's symbols and studied them again, trying to find any hint of meaning. Some of the patterns resembled mathematical diagrams, circles subdivided into sections, spirals marked with regular intervals, geometric constructions that might represent ratios or relationships. Others looked more pictographic, abstract shapes that could have been stylized representations of objects or concepts. One symbol appeared repeatedly throughout the carvings, a circle containing a spiral, with 3 curved lines radiating from the center like arms or rays. It appeared alone, in various sizes, and also integrated into larger composite symbols. It seemed to be key somehow, a central motif that organized or explained the others. I sketched it in my field notebook, trying different interpretations. Could it represent the section itself? A circle of land with the spiral of rotation. The 3 arms might indicate the 3 observable effects: magnetic, temporal, spatial. Or perhaps they represented something else entirely, some concept that had no parallel in my understanding of physics. My satellite phone rang at 9:47 p.m., startling me badly enough that I nearly dropped my coffee mug. The number was blocked, which was unusual. Victor's calls usually showed his number. Dr. Ventura. The voice was female, older, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Yes, who is this? My name is not important. I'm calling on behalf of the Stillwater Trust to discuss your current activities at Section 14. My stomach clenched. How did you get this number? We've been monitoring the site, Dr. Ventura. We know you've been conducting surveys there for the past week. We know you've discovered the primary structure, and we're calling to request that you discontinue your investigation immediately. I'm conducting a legitimate scientific survey, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I have permission from the property owner, the trust, to be here. You have permission from Mr. Krell, who is not authorized to grant access. The trust does not approve external research at this location. Please pack your equipment and leave by tomorrow morning. And if I refuse? There was a pause, long enough that I thought the connection might have dropped. Then the woman continued, her tone unchanged. The trust does not wish to interfere with your career, Dr. Ventura. We understand you're deeply in debt, that your position at Meridian Geospatial is precarious, that you need the income from this project. We're prepared to compensate you for your time. $20,000, wired immediately, in exchange for all data you've collected and your agreement not to discuss or publish any findings. You're trying to buy my silence. We're trying to protect something that requires protection. The structure you found is dangerous, Dr. Ventura. Not in ways you can see yet, but dangerous nonetheless. People who have spent too much time near it have experienced lasting effects, cognitive changes, perceptual distortions, temporal dissociation. Helena Voss spent the last 15 years of her life in a sanitarium, unable to distinguish past from present, her memory scrambled by exposure to the structure's influence. You're saying the pillar drove her insane. I'm saying it affects human cognition in ways we don't fully understand. The rotation you've documented is just the most obvious manifestation. There are other effects, more subtle, that accumulate with prolonged exposure. We've spent a century trying to understand how to contain or neutralize those effects. Your presence there, your investigation, risks not only your own well-being but potentially creates a situation where we lose containment entirely. I thought about the disorientation I'd been experiencing, the time discrepancies, the sense that space wasn't configured correctly. I'd attributed all of it to the physical phenomena I was measuring. But what if the woman was right? What if the pillar was affecting my brain directly, altering my perception and cognition in ways I couldn't detect? I need proof, I said. Medical records, research data, something that demonstrates these effects you're claiming. We don't share our research with outsiders. That's the point of containment. But I can tell you that 5 people have attempted serious studies of the structure since 1922. 2 died under unclear circumstances. 2 became cognitively impaired. Only 1 walked away intact, and that was Victor Krell, who we believe has been protected by his superficial approach. He observed but never truly investigated. And now I'm investigating properly, so you want me to stop. We want you to stop before you experience irreversible harm, yes. And before your investigation attracts attention from people who would exploit what you found. $20,000, Dr. Ventura, more than Victor offered you. Enough to resolve your immediate financial crisis. All we ask is that you leave and stay silent. I should have been tempted. 20,000 would have solved everything. The debt, the rent, the constant financial anxiety that had been my companion for years. But the offer made me angry instead. The trust had sat on this discovery for a century, done nothing productive with it, just protected and concealed it while one of the most significant phenomena in physics remained unknown to science. No, I said. I'm going to finish my survey, document my findings, and publish them. If the pillar is dangerous, then people need to know so they can study it safely. If it has valuable properties, then keeping it secret only prevents beneficial applications. Either way, hiding it serves no one. You're making a mistake, Dr. Ventura. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. The line went dead. I sat holding the phone, my hand shaking slightly, wondering what I just committed myself to. The trust had resources and motivation to stop me. They might send people to physically remove me from the site. They might sabotage my equipment or corrupt my data. They might, and this thought was genuinely frightening, decide that I'd become enough of a threat to require permanent silencing. But I couldn't walk away. Not now, when I documented something that could revolutionize our understanding of physics. Not when I'd proven that space-time manipulation was possible. Not when I'd found evidence that human, or non-human, engineering could create localized violations of conservation laws. I backed up all my data to multiple drives and uploaded encrypted copies to cloud storage. I wrote a detailed email to Denise at Meridian, explaining what I'd found and where the data was stored, with instructions to release it publicly if I didn't check in by the end of the week. I sent a similar email to Victor and to 2 former professors whose judgment I trusted. Then I secured my camp as well as I could, locked my valuable equipment in the van, and tried to sleep while wondering if the trust would send someone tonight or wait until morning. Nothing happened. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, and I was still alone at the site. I checked my equipment. Nothing had been tampered with. The time-lapse cameras were still recording. The GPS monitors continued tracking coordinates. The seismograph showed the same steady vibration pattern. Either the trust's warning had been a bluff, or they were waiting to see if I would comply voluntarily before escalating their response. I decided to complete my survey as quickly as possible. Whatever the trust might do, I needed to finish documenting the site while I still could. I spent Monday doing a final comprehensive GPS survey, taking readings at a dense grid of points across the entire section. The resulting data set would let me create a high-resolution map showing exactly how the rotation varied across the space. The work was tedious but necessary, walking grid lines, stopping every 20 meters to take a reading, marking each point with numbered flags. By late afternoon, I'd covered most of the section, accumulating thousands of individual measurements that would take days to process properly. Tuesday morning, I woke to find my van's tires slashed. All 4 of them cut deeply enough that they couldn't be repaired. Someone had come during the night, quiet enough that I hadn't woken, and disabled my only transportation. I was stranded at the site, 2 hours from Seattle, with no way to leave except by calling for help. I checked my equipment immediately. Nothing else had been damaged, but next to my laptop on the folding table was a handwritten note. Last warning, leave now or face consequences. The handwriting was neat and precise, written with what looked like a fountain pen on heavy paper stock. Professional, almost formal, which somehow made the threat more credible than if it had been scrawled hastily. I called Victor, but his phone went to voicemail. I tried 3 more times over the next hour with the same result. Either he wasn't answering, or someone had gotten to him first. I called a towing service in Ellensburg, explaining that I needed 4 new tires installed at my location. The dispatcher was apologetic but firm. They didn't have anyone available until Wednesday, and even then it would be expensive to bring a service truck to such a remote location. $400 minimum, probably closer to $600 with the cost of tires. I agreed to the Wednesday appointment and settled in to wait. I wasn't leaving, even if the trust wanted me gone. I had enough food and water for another week. My satellite phone had plenty of battery life, and I still had one more task to complete: A final descent into the chamber to document the pillar thoroughly enough that I'd never need to return. I gathered everything I might need: camera, video equipment, detailed measuring tools, paper for making rubbings of the symbols, sampling supplies in case I decided to take material from the pillar or chamber walls. Then I hiked to the shaft opening, moved aside the camouflage, and began my descent. The rope felt different this time, heavier, or maybe I was just more tired than previous descents. I lowered myself carefully, watching the stone walls pass as I dropped into darkness. My flashlight beam showed the familiar fitted stonework, unchanged from my previous visits. But when my feet touched the chamber floor and I unclipped from the rope, I realized immediately that something had changed. The pillar was rotating. Not the slow, imperceptible rotation I'd measured in the land above, but visible motion, the pillar turning on its base at perhaps 1 revolution per minute. The carved symbols blurred slightly as they passed, the phosphorescent glow pulsing faster now, no longer the steady 30-second intervals but quickening towards something more frantic. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. This was new. This was different from every previous observation. The pillar had been stationary before, immobile, fixed, eternal. Now it was moving, responding to something, perhaps waking from a long dormancy. The magnetic field had intensified. I could feel it even without instruments, a pressure in my sinuses and ears, a sense that the air itself had become thicker or charged. The chamber's temperature had dropped several degrees, cold enough that my breath fogged in the flashlight beam. And there was sound, faint but definitely present, a low-frequency hum or vibration that I felt more than heard, resonating in my chest and bones. The pillar was generating audible sound now, or maybe the sound had always been there, and I was only now sensitive enough to perceive it. I took photographs frantically, documenting the rotation from multiple angles, trying to capture the changed state before it shifted again. The symbols that had been static were now flowing past the camera's view, and I had to time my shots carefully to capture specific sections clearly. One symbol caught my attention, the repeated motif I'd noticed before, the circle with spiral and 3 arms. It was glowing more brightly than the others, pulsing in syncopation with the pillar's rotation. Each time it came around to face me, the light intensified for a moment, as if the symbol was acknowledging my presence. I reached out carefully and touched the pillar's surface as it rotated past. The stone was cold and unnaturally smooth, vibrating slightly under my fingers. The moment my hand made contact, the rotation accelerated. Now the pillar was spinning at perhaps 3 or 4 revolutions per minute, fast enough that the symbols became completely blurred. The hum increased in pitch and volume, rising from subsonic rumble towards something almost musical. The phosphorescent glow spread from the carvings to the entire pillar surface, until the whole thing was blazing with blue-white light that filled the chamber and cast sharp shadows on the walls. I pulled my hand back and the acceleration continued. 5 rotations per minute, 8, 10. The pillar was spinning faster than should have been possible without flying apart, and yet it remained solid, intact, the stones somehow holding together despite centrifugal forces that should have shattered it. The chamber floor began to vibrate in resonance. Dust and small stones danced and skittered across the smooth rock. The walls themselves seemed to be moving, though whether they were actually shifting or whether it was an optical illusion created by the pillar's light and motion, I couldn't determine. I knew I should leave. I should climb back up the shaft immediately, get away from whatever was happening before it became catastrophic. But I was frozen, mesmerized by the accelerating rotation, unable to look away from the spinning column of light and stone. The hum reached a crescendo, no longer musical but almost painful in its intensity. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the sound wasn't just auditory. It was resonating through my entire body, vibrating my bones and organs, making my vision blur and my balance falter. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The pillar locked into stillness so suddenly that I stumbled, my inner ear expecting continued motion that didn't occur. The light dimmed back to its previous gentle glow. The hum ceased entirely, leaving only ringing silence. The chamber floor stopped vibrating. But something had changed. The pillar's orientation was different from before. The symbols I'd been photographing were no longer aligned the same way. The pillar had rotated exactly 90 degrees from its previous position, turning to face a new cardinal direction. And carved into the surface at exactly my eye level, where it hadn't been visible in the pillar's previous orientation, was a new symbol. Or not new, ancient like all the others, but newly revealed. A symbol I recognized because I'd seen it in my research on topological anomalies. It was a cartographic notation from medieval European maps, used to mark locations that were considered impossible or dangerous. A symbol that meant, roughly translated, here be dragons, here the world is broken, here the normal rules do not apply. Someone centuries ago had carved that warning into this pillar, using a notation that suggested European cartographic knowledge, which meant either Europeans had discovered this site long before official settlement, or whoever carved the pillar had knowledge of European symbolism, or, most disturbingly, the pillar itself was adapting, revealing symbols that would be meaningful to whoever observed it. I needed to leave. Whatever I just triggered by touching the rotating pillar, I'd crossed a threshold that felt dangerous in ways I couldn't articulate. The chamber no longer felt like an archaeological curiosity or a physics anomaly. It felt like something alive and aware, something that had been dormant and was now waking. I clipped back onto the rope and began climbing, hauling myself up the shaft as quickly as I could manage. The ascent felt longer than the descent, the darkness more oppressive, the stone walls seeming to press inward as I climbed. Twice I had to stop to catch my breath, my arms burning with the effort of pulling my weight upward. When I finally emerged into daylight, I collapsed on the ground beside the shaft opening, gasping and trembling. The normal world, sagebrush and rocks and wind and sky, seemed almost unreal after the chamber's intensity. I lay there for several minutes, letting my heart rate slow, trying to process what I'd just experienced. The pillar was active now, not just existing but responding, changing, accelerating towards something. My touch had triggered it, or maybe my continued presence at the site had accumulated enough influence to wake whatever intelligence or mechanism controlled it. Either way, I'd fundamentally altered the situation. I should have felt triumphant. I'd made first contact, essentially, with a technology so advanced it appeared magical. I'd triggered a response from an ancient system, proven it was interactive and possibly controllable. Instead, I felt terror, deep, primal fear that I'd done something irrevocable, unleashed something that should have remained dormant. I hiked back to camp quickly, glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see the ground opening behind me or the sky tearing apart. But the section looked normal, just empty land under afternoon sun, sage and grass and distant hills, everything as it should be. My equipment told a different story. The seismograph had registered the chamber's vibration, showing a spike of activity that peaked exactly when the pillar had been spinning fastest. The magnetometer, still positioned at the center point, showed the magnetic field had surged briefly to over 300,000 nanoteslas, 5 times Earth's normal field strength. And the GPS monitors were showing something impossible. During the few minutes when the pillar had been active, the entire section's coordinates had shifted by nearly 5 meters eastward, then snapped back to their original positions when the pillar stopped. The section had moved, not rotated, moved laterally, translated through space, before returning to its starting location. And that meant the pillar wasn't just controlling rotation. It was controlling the section's position in space itself, possibly its position in time as well. I reviewed my camera footage from the chamber, watching the pillar's acceleration, trying to understand what had triggered the 90-degree rotation. The video showed exactly what I remembered: the increasing speed, the intensifying light and sound, then sudden stillness in a new orientation. But there was something else in the footage, something I'd missed while experiencing it directly. In the final second before the pillar stopped, there were other presences in the chamber. Not visible exactly, but suggested. Shadows that didn't correspond to any physical objects. Distortions in the air like heat shimmer, but in cold environment. Fleeting impressions of forms or figures that appeared and vanished between video frames. I played the segment repeatedly, trying to convince myself I was seeing compression artifacts or optical illusions. But the impressions persisted across multiple reviews. Something else had been in that chamber with me, visible only for a fraction of a second, present just long enough to be captured on video, but not long enough for human perception to register. Visitors maybe, or guardians, or some artifact of the pillar's operation, manifestations of the forces it was manipulating. I didn't want to think about the implications. I especially didn't want to consider that the trust might have been right, that this was dangerous in ways I couldn't safely investigate alone. My phone rang again that evening, same blocked number as before. "You've activated it," the woman's voice said without preamble. "We're detecting significant changes in the site's electromagnetic signature. What did you do?" "I touched the pillar while it was rotating," I admitted. There was no point in lying. They obviously had sensors monitoring the section. It accelerated and then locked into a new orientation. I didn't know that would happen. "Of course you didn't. That's why we wanted you to stop before you reached the threshold. The structure has multiple operational states, Dr. Ventura. You've moved it from dormant to what we call first activation. There are at least 3 more states beyond that, each more dangerous and less controllable. So teach me how to control it. Share your research instead of just warning me away." "We don't know how to control it. We know how to keep it stable in dormant state, which we've done successfully for decades. But we've never intentionally activated it, never pushed it toward higher states, because we don't know what happens at maximum activation and we're afraid to find out." "Afraid of what?" The symbols reference a complete rotation, 360 degrees as a threshold. The section has been rotating at 1/3 degree per year for a century. At that rate, it will complete the full rotation in approximately another 1,000 years. But if the pillar is activated, if it's pushed into higher operational states, that rotation could accelerate dramatically. days instead of years, hours instead of days. And when it completes the full rotation, the symbols suggest transition, translation, movement to somewhere else. The section might physically relocate, spatial teleportation, or it might shift temporally, moving forward or backward in time. Or it might move into dimensions we don't have names for, leaving behind a void or a doorway or something worse. I thought about the coordinates lateral shift I'd measured during the pillar's activation. 5 meters of translation in a few seconds. If that scaled up, if a full rotation produced that effect sustained and amplified, the section could end up anywhere. Any location on Earth, any time in history, any configuration of space-time that the pillar's mathematics allowed. How do I reverse it? I asked. How do I return it to dormant state? We don't know. Every time we've attempted to study methods of deactivation, the researchers have either failed or experienced severe cognitive deterioration. The structure resists analysis. It wants to activate. It wants to complete its rotation and transition to wherever it's programmed to go. Then why hasn't it? If it's been operating for centuries or millennia, why hasn't it completed the cycle and transitioned already? We think it requires conscious interaction, an operator or observer who provides the final impetus. It's been waiting for someone to find it, understand it enough to begin activation, and then carry through the full sequence. You might be that person, Dr. Ventura. You might be the first one with both the knowledge to recognize what it is and the persistence to push it through all its states. I don't want to be that person. Then leave. Immediately. Abandon your equipment, walk to the main road, and don't come back. We'll retrieve your materials, compensate you for the loss, and make sure the site is contained properly. I looked around my camp, the tent, the equipment, the documented evidence of the century's most significant physics discovery. Walking away would mean giving up everything I'd worked for, surrendering the proof that could establish my career and revolutionize human understanding of space-time. But staying might mean triggering something catastrophic. If the pillar could be activated further, if my continued presence was pushing it toward transition, then I was potentially threatening not just myself, but the entire region. A square mile of land suddenly translating to a different location or time would be devastating to anything it intersected with, anything that occupied the space where it appeared or was left behind when it vanished. I need time to think, I said. You don't have time. The structure is in an unstable state now. It might activate further spontaneously, or it might seek additional interaction. Either way, every hour you remain increases the risk. 24 hours, I countered. I'll give you my decision tomorrow evening. If I choose to leave, I'll do it on my own terms with my data and equipment intact. If I choose to stay, then at least I'll do so with full knowledge of the risks. The woman was silent for a long moment. 24 hours, she agreed finally. But understand, Dr. Ventura, if the site enters second activation before then, we will intervene physically to remove you. Your safety and the site's containment are both priorities, but containment takes precedence. The line went dead again. I sat in my tent as darkness fell, listening to the wind and trying to decide what kind of person I was. The kind who prioritized safety and accepted limitations, or the kind who pushed boundaries even when warned of consequences. I'd always thought I was the former, careful, methodical, risk-averse. That's what made me a good cartographer. Maps required precision and patience, attention to detail, and willingness to verify measurements repeatedly. But I'd also spent 3 years barely surviving financially rather than giving up on my chosen career. I'd taken a job from a stranger offering too much money for strange work. I descended alone into an underground chamber containing inexplicable technology. At every decision point, I'd chosen the riskier path. Maybe I'd always been this person, someone who needed to know regardless of cost. The question was whether that curiosity was worth potentially catastrophic consequences. I reviewed my data again, looking for anything that might guide my decision. The GPS logs showed the section had been oscillating at increasing amplitude over the past week. The elliptical paths were growing larger, as if the activation had destabilized whatever mechanism kept the section anchored in its current location. If the trend continued, within a few days the section might be shifting meters per hour, soon becoming dangerous to anyone inside or near it. The magnetic field data showed similar trends. The spiral was tightening, the center point intensifying, as if the pillar was drawing energy inward in preparation for release. And the time-lapse footage showed the luminescent spiral's procession continuing. They were now tilted nearly 45 degrees from vertical, halfway to horizontal. At the current rate, they'd be completely horizontal within another week. Everything was accelerating towards some kind of threshold. The pillar's activation had set in motion a sequence of changes that appeared to be building toward culmination. I could document it. I could stay and measure exactly what happened as the system approached transition. I could be the first human to observe whatever the pillar was designed to do, to witness space-time manipulation at scales that would rewrite physics textbooks. Or I could leave, let the trust contain the sight, and live the rest of my life wondering what I'd missed. The decision should have been obvious: safety over knowledge, survival over curiosity. But I kept thinking about Helena Voss, the physician who'd spent years studying this site, who'd ended her life unable to distinguish past from present. The question that haunted me wasn't what had happened to Helena Voss. The trust had told me that, whether or not I fully believed their account. The question was, what had she discovered that made her willing to sacrifice her sanity to understand it? I stayed up all night Tuesday, unable to sleep, watching the luminescent spirals appear at their appointed time. They were definitely at 45 degrees now, tilted halfway between vertical and horizontal, and their rotation had accelerated slightly. Where before they'd completed one revolution every 3 minutes, now they were rotating every 2.5 minutes. The change was small but measurable, and it suggested the system was indeed building towards something. Around 4 a.m., I made my decision. Not to leave, not to stay indefinitely, but to conduct one more systematic set of measurements over the next 24 hours. I would document exactly how the system was changing, capture the acceleration toward whatever threshold was approaching, and then, before it reached critical state, I would extract myself and all my data. I would have proof that couldn't be dismissed, observations of an active transition that no other researcher had ever recorded, and I would leave before the risks became existential. It was a compromise, the kind of middle path I'd always been good at finding. Not the safest choice, not the boldest, but practical and defensible. Wednesday morning, the towing service arrived earlier than expected. The driver was a taciturn man in his 50s who asked no questions about why I was camping alone in the middle of nowhere with sophisticated surveying equipment. He replaced all 4 tires efficiently, accepted my credit card payment with a grunt, and left without conversation beyond the necessary transaction. With transportation restored, I felt less trapped. I could leave quickly if I needed to. The van was my escape route, and having it operational gave me the psychological safety to continue observing. I spent Wednesday systematically documenting the section's current state. GPS readings every hour at multiple locations, magnetic field measurements in a grid pattern, seismograph data showing the increasing vibration frequency, photographs of the surface, the equipment, the landscape. I even flew a small drone I'd brought but hadn't yet used, capturing aerial footage that showed the section from above, looking completely ordinary. Just another square mile of undeveloped land that gave no hint of the impossible machinery operating beneath it. By Wednesday afternoon, the changes were becoming more pronounced. The GPS coordinates were oscillating with amplitudes now measured in meters rather than centimeters. The magnetic field had intensified by another 15%, and I could feel the effects more strongly. The disorientation was constant now rather than intermittent, and time seemed to flow at inconsistent rates. My watch would say 20 minutes had passed, while my perception insisted it had been 5 minutes or 45, with no way to reconcile the discrepancy. I called Victor again, and this time he answered, sounding exhausted. "Iris, are you all right?" "Physically, yes. Mentally, I'm not sure anymore. The pillar is active. The whole system is accelerating. How much did the trust tell you when they contacted you?" "They didn't contact me. I've been in the hospital since Monday night. Heart attack, or something they thought was a heart attack. Turned out to be severe arrhythmia brought on by what the doctors are calling unexplained electromagnetic exposure. They asked me if I'd been near any high-voltage equipment or industrial magnets. My stomach dropped. The pillar, the magnetic field is intensifying, if you were thinking about it, focusing on it. Then maybe I was connected to it somehow. Entangled, if you want to use quantum terminology that's probably not even applicable here. Iris, you need to be careful. This thing isn't just a machine or artifact. It responds to attention, to intention. The more you focus on it, the more connected you become." "How long were you exposed before the arrhythmia started?" "I've been thinking about that section for 43 years, but the symptoms only appeared after you activated the pillar. Like my decades of observation had created a link, and when you triggered the state change, it affected me at a distance. That was terrifying. If the pillar could affect people remotely through some kind of attentional connection, then I was far more deeply involved than I'd realized. I'd spent days in direct contact with it, hours in the chamber, constant focus on understanding its function. If Victor's theory was right, I was probably more entangled with the system than anyone since Helena Voss." "Have you experienced any cognitive effects?" Victor asked. "Memory problems, temporal confusion, difficulty maintaining linear thought?" I wanted to say no, but when I tried to recall the sequence of the past week's events, I found strange gaps and inconsistencies. Some days felt like they'd lasted forever. Others seemed to have passed in hours, and there were moments I couldn't quite remember, gaps in my timeline where I must have done something but had no clear recollection of the activities. "Some confusion," I admitted. "Nothing severe, but I'm having trouble tracking time accurately." That was Helena's first symptom. Start recording yourself regularly. Voice memos, written notes with timestamps. If you begin to lose coherence, you'll have a record to help you recognize the deterioration. Victor, if you're right about the entanglement, then I can't just walk away. If I'm connected to the pillar now, leaving won't protect me. The only way through is to understand what's happening well enough to consciously disconnect, or to let it complete its cycle, to guide it through transition and see where it goes. That's what Helena tried to do, I think. She realized she was entangled, and instead of fighting it, she tried to ride it through to conclusion, and ended up in a sanitarium unable to distinguish past from present. Or, Victor said quietly, ended up experiencing past and present simultaneously, existing in multiple time streams at once. The sanitarium records describe her as prophetic. She would speak about events before they happened, describe historical incidents with impossible accuracy. What if she wasn't insane? What if she'd become unstuck in time, able to perceive the full four-dimensional structure of causality? That's not survival, Victor. That's a different kind of death. Maybe, or maybe it's transcendence. Becoming something more than human by integrating with a system that operates outside normal space-time constraints. I didn't want transcendence. I wanted to understand the pillar, document its function, and return to normal life with my findings. But I was starting to realize those goals might be mutually exclusive. You couldn't touch something this profound without being changed by it. We talked for another 20 minutes, Victor sharing what little he knew about Helena Voss's later years and the fragmented accounts of her experiences. Then he needed to rest. The hospital was keeping him for observation, and I was alone again with my thoughts and my data. Wednesday evening, I made my final decision. I would descend into the chamber once more tonight and attempt direct communication with the pillar. If it was responding to attention and intention as Victor suggested, then perhaps it could be queried, asked to explain its purpose or reveal its destination. If it was truly interactive technology rather than just automated machinery, there might be a way to negotiate or understand the terms of engagement. It was a risk, but every choice at this point carried risk, and at least this one offered the possibility of genuine understanding. I waited until the luminescent spirals appeared at 2:47 a.m. Thursday morning. I wanted the system to be in its most active state, most responsive to interaction. Then I gathered minimal equipment, flashlight, camera, voice recorder, my field notebook, and hiked to the shaft opening. The section felt different at night with the spirals visible overhead. The blue-white glow cast everything in strange relief, creating shadows that moved as the spirals rotated. The landscape seemed to pulse in time with their rhythm, as if the entire square mile was breathing. I descended into the chamber more slowly than my previous visits, paying careful attention to my perceptions and mental state. The stone walls passed at what felt like normal speed. My thoughts remained clear and organized. Whatever entanglement I developed with the pillar, it wasn't yet severe enough to cause obvious disorientation. At the bottom, the chamber was as I'd left it, the pillar standing in its new orientation, the carved warning symbol visible at eye level. But the light was brighter now, the phosphorescence intense enough to illuminate the entire chamber without my flashlight. And the sound was back, that subsonic hum I'd heard during the activation, now present at a lower level, a constant vibration that resonated through the floor and walls. I approached the pillar carefully, stopping about 2 meters away, close enough to see details, far enough to retreat quickly if needed. "I don't know if you can understand me," I said aloud, feeling foolish but committed to the attempt. "I'm trying to comprehend what you are and what you're meant to do. If you can communicate, if there's any way for us to exchange information, I'm here to learn. The pillar's light pulsed once, brighter than the ambient glow, then returned to its baseline. Acknowledgement, maybe, or just a random fluctuation. The symbols on your surface suggest you're counting towards something. A rotation, a transition, a journey to somewhere else. I've activated you, apparently, started you on a path toward that transition. Can you show me what happens when you reach completion? Another pulse, this one slower and more sustained. The light brightened gradually, and as it did, the symbols began to stand out in higher relief, as if they were rising from the stone surface. Not physically moving, the pillar remained smooth to visual inspection, but appearing to have depth and dimensionality they'd lacked before. I stepped closer despite my caution, drawn by the changing appearance. The symbols were definitely three-dimensional now, or creating the illusion of depth through some manipulation of light and perception. They formed a spiral pattern when viewed from above. I realized all the individual symbols arranged in a grand design that wound around the pillar from base to apex. And within that spiral, I could see movement. Not the symbols themselves moving, but something visible through them, as if they were windows or portals showing other places or times. I saw landscapes that weren't the chamber, forests and mountains, cities with unfamiliar architecture, star fields that didn't match Earth's sky. The visions lasted only seconds each, cycling through dozens of different views, all of them sharing a sense of vast distance or vast time separating them from the present moment. You're a navigation device, I breathed, understanding suddenly. A waypoint or coordinate system for traveling between locations. The rotation isn't just turning, it's dialing, selecting a destination from a vast set of possibilities. The light pulsed affirmatively, or at least I interpreted it that way. The visions in the symbols continued cycling, faster now, showing me glimpses of what might be reachable through the pillar's operation. And the transition, when the rotation completes, this section of land travels to whichever destination is selected. Another pulse. The vision slowed, focusing on a handful of recurring images. One showed what looked like the same landscape as the section's current location, but different, lusher vegetation, clearer water, no human structures visible. Another showed a similar landscape but colder, ice-covered, perhaps glacial. A third showed the section underwater, as if the land had sunk below sea level or sea level had risen dramatically. Different times, I realized. The destinations were all the same location spatially, but different temporal coordinates. The pillar could move the section through time, forward or backward, to any point in this location's history or future. How do you choose which destination? I asked. How do you select which time period to transition to? The symbols shifted, reorganizing themselves into what looked like a coordinate system, lines and grids, mathematical relationships shown in visual form. It was complex, far beyond my ability to read quickly, but the general structure was clear. Inputs on one axis determined temporal displacement. Inputs on another axis determined some other variable I couldn't immediately identify. Position within higher dimensions, maybe, or probability branches in quantum space. And the operator, the person who activates you, they provide those inputs through intention or attention or some other means. The light pulsed rapidly, multiple times, suggesting multiple layers of answer. Yes, the operator influenced destination selection, but also the pillar itself had preferences or constraints, built-in parameters that limited possible destinations. And there were other factors, environmental conditions, stellar alignments, quantum states that created windows of opportunity when certain destinations became accessible while others closed. So I've activated you, which means I'm now the operator. I'm influencing where you'll go when transition completes. Strong pulse, definite affirmation. Can I choose to abort? Can I deactivate you, return you to dormant state, prevent the transition? The light dimmed, almost going dark before returning to baseline. A negative clearly communicated. Once activated, the sequence proceeded to completion. The only variables were timing and destination, not whether transition occurred. How long until transition? The symbols shifted again, this time showing what looked like astronomical diagrams, planetary positions, lunar phases, perhaps stellar configurations. I couldn't read the notation precisely, but the general time frame became apparent. Transition would occur at a specific alignment of celestial bodies, which based on the diagrams appeared to be approaching rapidly. Days, not weeks, maybe as few as 3 or 4 days. And when transition happens, what about people who are present? Do they travel with the section, or are they left behind? The visions in the symbols changed, showing human figures, stylized but recognizable. Some figures moved with the section, traveling to the destination time period. Others remained in the present, left behind as the land around them vanished. The determining factor appeared to be proximity and intention. Those who were consciously connected to the pillar, who had accepted their role as operators or participants, traveled with it. Those who were present accidentally or unconsciously remained in the departure timeline. So I'll travel with it, because I've activated it, studied it, become entangled with it. Affirmative pulse. Can I bring others? Can I choose who comes with me? The light flickered uncertainty. Possibly, the answer seemed to suggest, but attempting to bring unwilling participants could destabilize the transition, create paradoxes or conflicts that would damage the mechanism or the travelers. I stood in the chamber, processing the implications of what I'd learned. The pillar was functional technology, sophisticated beyond anything human civilization had created, and I'd set it in motion toward an irrevocable transition to some other time period. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't escape it. I was entangled now, marked as an operator, and I would travel with the section whether I wanted to or not. The only choice I had was where we would go, what time period I would select, consciously or unconsciously, through my intentions and attention over the next few days as the system approached its transition window. What time period are you suggesting? I asked. The visions you've shown me are those recommendations, optimal destinations. The symbols arranged themselves into chronological order, I thought, showing a sequence of possible times. The pattern suggested periods of low human population density, times when a square mile of land could appear or disappear without catastrophic consequences for surrounding inhabitants. One vision repeated more frequently than others, the same landscape as the current section, but appearing even more untouched than in the other previews. Vegetation was dense but not quite familiar, subtly different species ratios than the present day. The sky was clear of any aircraft or satellites. No roads visible, no power lines, no human structures within viewing range. How far back is that? The astronomical diagrams shifted and I tried to read them. The stellar positions suggested centuries, millennia. I couldn't be precise, but it was clearly pre-colonial, possibly pre-human for this region. You're suggesting I travel backward to a time before European settlement. Before indigenous settlements too, maybe. Why? The answer came not as light pulses, but as a subtle shift in the chamber itself. The temperature dropped further, and for a moment I could see them clearly. The shadowy figures I'd glimpsed in my previous visit's video, now manifesting with enough presence to be visible to direct observation. They weren't ghosts or spirits. They were people, or had been people, wearing unfamiliar clothing, standing at different positions in the chamber as if separated by barriers of time rather than space. I counted 6 distinct figures, all of them appearing to be from different historical periods based on their dress and appearance. Previous operators, I realized. People who had activated the pillar in their own times, become entangled with it, and traveled to different destinations. They were still here, in some sense, preserved in the pillar's temporal structure, their presence echoing across the time periods they'd visited. One figure stood out from the others, a woman in early 20th century clothing, her face gaunt but her eyes bright with fevered intelligence. Helena Voss, I was certain. Not insane, not destroyed by the pillar's influence, but transformed into something that existed partially outside linear time. She met my eyes and I felt a shock of connection, recognition flowing both directions, as if she'd been waiting decades for someone like me to arrive and continue the work she'd begun. Her mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but could somehow understand. Choose carefully. The journey is one way, but the destination shapes everything. Then she and the other figures faded, leaving me alone again with the pillar's steady glow. I climbed back up the shaft with trembling arms, my mind reeling from what I'd learned and experienced. The section was going to transition within days. I was going with it whether I chose to or not, and I needed to decide when we would go. Returning to camp, I found another note on my equipment table. Same neat handwriting as before. We know you made contact. We're prepared to evacuate the surrounding area and contain the transition. But we need you to select a destination that won't cause temporal paradoxes. Pre-human or far future. Nothing within recorded history. So the trust had been monitoring somehow. Cameras I hadn't detected, or maybe some kind of remote sensing of the pillar's activity. They knew I was committed to transition now, and they were trying to minimize the damage to the timeline. I spent the rest of Thursday reviewing everything I documented, trying to think through the implications of different destination choices. Going backward to pre-human times would mean arriving in a pristine wilderness, but with no way to return to the present and no infrastructure to support survival. Going forward to the far future meant arriving in an unknown world that might be uninhabitable or incomprehensible. There was a third option, one the pillar had shown me, but the trust had forbidden. Traveling to a time within recorded history, arriving in a period where I might be able to integrate into human society, and potentially use my knowledge of the pillar to affect historical outcomes. That way lay paradox and potential catastrophe, but it also offered the possibility of purpose, arriving in a time when knowledge of the pillar's existence could make a difference, when warning future generations might prevent disasters or enable breakthroughs. Friday morning, I woke to find Victor standing next to my tent. He looked terrible, pale and unsteady, clearly having checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice. "I felt it yesterday," he said without greeting. "The connection intensifying. I knew you'd made contact and I knew you were approaching transition. I had to come." "Victor, you should be in the hospital. You're not well enough to." "I'm entangled too," he interrupted. 43 years of observation created a link. When you activated the pillar, it pulled me in. I'm traveling with the section whether I'm physically present or not, so I might as well be here to experience it consciously. I helped him to a folding chair and brought him water. He drank gratefully, then looked at me with those pale gray-green eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Have you chosen a destination?" "I'm still deciding. The trust wants pre-human or far future to avoid paradoxes. But the pillar keeps showing me periods within human history, suggesting those are viable options." "Helena went backward," Victor said, "to sometime around 1650, according to her medical records. She spent years experiencing that time period overlaid on the present, unable to fully inhabit either timeline. That's what drove her to the sanitarium. Not insanity, but existing in two times simultaneously." "How do you know that?" "I found her journals years ago, hidden in the Historical Society archives, misfiled under a different name. She documented her experiences in remarkable detail, describing a version of this landscape before European contact, before indigenous settlements had fully developed this region. She wrote about meeting people who wouldn't be born for decades and remembering events that hadn't happened yet. And she wrote about the choice she'd made, going backward instead of forward, and how she'd come to regret it." "Why did she regret it?" "Because she could observe but not interact. She was temporally displaced, experiencing the past but unable to affect it in any meaningful way. She became a witness to history rather than a participant in her own life. That's what killed her, eventually. The isolation of existing between times, unable to fully connect with either." I thought about that. The profound loneliness of being unstuck in time, able to see but not touch, to know but not change. It sounded like a special kind of hell, even if it came with the thrill of witnessing history directly. "So what do you recommend?" I asked. "Go forward," Victor said firmly. 500 years, 1,000, whatever period the astronomical alignments favor. Arrive in a future where technology might be advanced enough to understand what you've experienced, where the pillar's existence might be valuable rather than just frightening. Leave this time behind and see what humanity becomes." "That's easy for you to say. You've lived your life. You're 71 and you've had a career and relationships and experiences. I'm 34. I'm supposed to give up everything I know, everyone I've ever met, and jump blind into an unknowable future." "You don't have a choice about whether to jump," Victor reminded me. "You're entangled. The only choice is where you land." He was right. The decision had been made days ago when I first touched the rotating pillar. Now I was just negotiating the terms of an irrevocable transition. "Come with me then," I said impulsively. "If you're entangled anyway, if you're traveling regardless of physical location, stay here. Be present for the transition. We'll arrive together in whatever future we select." Victor smiled, the expression transforming his exhausted face into something almost peaceful. "I'd like that. I've spent 43 years wondering what's on the other side of this mystery. Seems fitting to find out in person rather than just observing from a distance." We spent Friday preparing for transition, as if preparing for a long journey, which I supposed it was. I backed up all my data one final time, uploading encrypted copies to multiple cloud services with instructions to release them publicly if we didn't return. I packed essential equipment, tools, supplies, weapons, medical gear, everything that might be useful in an unknown future. I wrote letters to Denise, to my family, to the professors who'd supervised my doctoral work, trying to explain what I was about to do without sounding completely insane. Victor made his own preparations, writing similar letters and settling his affairs via phone and email. He was calm about it all, almost serene, as if he'd been waiting his whole adult life for this moment. Friday night, the luminescent spirals appeared at 2:47 a.m. as they had every night, but now they were completely horizontal, parallel to the ground, forming what looked like a vast circular platform of light hovering above the section. The transformation from vertical to horizontal was complete, the final configuration before transition. "Tomorrow night," Victor said, watching the spirals with evident awe. "The astronomical alignment occurs at 11:37 p.m. Saturday, according to my calculations. That's when the pillar will complete its sequence and initiate transition. Less than 24 hours remained." I spent Saturday morning at the chamber one final time, standing before the pillar and consciously focusing my intention on a destination. Not just any future, but a specific window, 500 years forward, far enough to bypass any immediate catastrophes, but close enough that human civilization would likely still exist in recognizable form. The pillar's light pulsed acknowledgement, and the visions in its symbols shifted to show me glimpses of that chosen time. I saw the same landscape transformed, forests where sage brush now grew, clean water flowing where the creek currently appeared and vanished mysteriously. I saw structures in the distance that might have been buildings or might have been something else, architecture that followed unfamiliar principles. And I saw people, not many, but definitely present, humans or post-humans who inhabited this future time, who moved through the landscape with purposes I couldn't discern from brief visions. They looked mostly human, though there were subtle differences I couldn't quite identify. It would do. It would have to do. I'd chosen a destination, the pillar had accepted it, and now we just had to wait for the alignment that would enable transition. I emerged from the chamber and found the section had become crowded. The trust had arrived in force. 3 vehicles parked along Meridian Cutoff, maybe a dozen people setting up equipment that looked like a combination of surveying gear and something more exotic. They'd established a perimeter at the section's boundaries, and they were measuring something with instruments I didn't recognize. A woman approached me as I walked back toward camp, older, maybe 60, with steel gray hair and the same neat, precise appearance as the handwriting on the notes I'd received. "Dr. Ventura, I'm Dr. Sarah Kimball, current administrator of the Stillwater Trust. We need to discuss containment protocols for tonight's transition. You're not going to try to stop it." "We can't stop it. Once activated to this degree, the mechanism proceeds to completion regardless of external intervention. We learned that the hard way in 1973 when we attempted to physically dismantle a similar structure in Nevada. The transition occurred anyway, and the dismantled pieces vanished along with everything else within the bounded area. There are others. I'd assumed the pillar was unique, but of course it couldn't be. If this was navigation technology, there must be multiple waypoints, multiple coordinates to travel between. 11 that we know of worldwide, Dr. Kimball confirmed. All of them similar structures buried beneath land that exhibits low-level rotational properties. We monitor them all, keep them dormant when possible, and document transitions when they occur despite our containment efforts. How many successful transitions have you observed? 3, including this one. The 1973 Nevada event I mentioned. A site in Siberia that transitioned in 1997, and now here. The other sites remain dormant, maintained in stable state through methods we've developed over decades of study. And the people who travel with the section, what happens to them? We don't know. They vanish along with the land, and we have no way to track them into their destination timeline. We assume they survived. The structures seem designed to facilitate safe passage, but we have no confirmation. Helena Voss survived, I said. She traveled and came back somehow, or existed in multiple times simultaneously. Dr. Kimball's expression tightened. Helena Voss existed in a state we don't fully understand. She was temporally coherent, yes, but fractured across multiple present moments. We don't recommend that as a model for successful transition. Then what do you recommend? Full commitment. Choose your destination deliberately, focus your intention clearly, and accept that you won't return to this timeline. You'll arrive in whatever future you've selected, and you'll have to build a new life there with whatever resources and knowledge you carry with you. That's what I'm doing, I said. Victor and I have chosen 500 years forward. We're prepared to adapt to whatever we find there. Dr. Kimball nodded slowly. 500 years is far enough to avoid major paradoxes. You should arrive in a period where your knowledge of the pillar's location and function could be valuable without disrupting the timeline that leads to your departure. That's as good a destination as any. She handed me a small metal case, surprisingly heavy for its size. What's this? Supplies you might need. High-density power cells, basic medical equipment, documentation of what we know about the structures and their operation. Consider it our contribution to your journey, knowledge that might help you understand where you've arrived and how to proceed. I accepted the case, touched by the gesture despite everything the trust had done to obstruct my research. They were trying to help now, in their way, providing resources for a journey into complete unknown. The rest of Saturday passed in preparation and waiting. More trust personnel arrived, establishing what looked like a full scientific observation post around the section's perimeter. They were going to document the transition thoroughly. I realized, probably the best recorded such event they'd ever had the opportunity to observe. Victor and I made camp at the center point, directly above the pillar's location, figuring that was the optimal position to ensure we traveled with the section. We set up our tents, arranged our equipment and supplies, and waited for sunset to bring us closer to the transition window. At 9:30 p.m., 2 hours before the predicted transition time, the luminescent spirals began to intensify. The blue-white glow brightened until it was almost painful to look at directly, and the spirals started rotating faster, now completing a revolution every 30 seconds instead of every few minutes. The ground beneath us began to vibrate, a steady oscillation that matched the pillar's rhythm. The seismograph was going crazy, registering the equivalent of a magnitude 3 earthquake, though the motion felt different from tectonic activity, more organized, more purposeful, like a machine ramping up to operational speed. At 10:00 p.m., the GPS coordinates began shifting erratically. The section was oscillating through space now, moving meters or tens of meters in various directions before snapping back to nominal position. Each oscillation lasted only seconds, but they were increasing in frequency and amplitude. At 10:30 p.m., time started to become obviously non-linear. I would check my watch and see 10:31, then look again and see 10:29, then 10:34. Causality was becoming flexible within the section's boundaries, past and future beginning to overlap and exchange positions. Victor sat calmly through all of this, his face illuminated by the spiral's glow, looking more at peace than I'd ever seen him. He'd made his choice decades ago, I realized. Everything since then had been waiting for this moment. At 11:00 p.m., the chamber opened. Not physically, no shaft or doorway appeared, but spatially. I could suddenly see down through the ground to where the pillar stood, the stone and soil between us becoming transparent or somehow negligible. The pillar was spinning now, rotating at tremendous speed, the carved symbols blurring into continuous patterns of light. At 11:15 p.m., I started to see the destination, not as vision or preview, but as actual present reality overlapping with our current time. The future landscape superimposed on the present one, trees and structures becoming visible in the same space as sagebrush and rocks, both times existing simultaneously for a few minutes before transition. The future was real. It was waiting for us, already present in embryonic form, just separated by 500 years of linear time that we were about to bypass. At 11:30 p.m., 7 minutes before transition, Dr. Kimball's voice came over a loudspeaker from the Trust's observation post. Final warning. Anyone remaining within the section's boundaries will transition with it. This is your last opportunity to evacuate. Neither Victor nor I moved. We were committed. At 11:35 p.m., the spirals suddenly stopped rotating and instead began to contract, drawing inward toward the center point where we sat. The light intensified beyond anything I'd experienced, becoming a physical presence that pressed against my skin and filled my lungs. At 11:36 p.m., I heard the pillar's voice, not as sound but as direct consciousness, thought speaking to thought across the quantum foam that separated minds. Destination confirmed. Operator accepted. Transition initiating. At 11:37 p.m., exactly as predicted by astronomical alignment, the section rotated. Not slowly, not imperceptibly, but instantly. A complete 360-degree rotation that occurred in zero time. The land spinning beneath us while we remained stationary or perhaps spun with it. Impossible to tell which. And when the rotation completed, we were elsewhere. The landscape was the same but utterly different. The roads were gone. The sagebrush had transformed into a different ecosystem. The forests I'd seen in the visions, lush and dense, and filled with unfamiliar bird calls. The air smelled different, cleaner, with none of the subtle petroleum and agricultural notes that had characterized 21st century central Washington. The sky was darker, stars more visible than they should have been, and I could see structures on the horizon, vast buildings or installations that glowed with soft light. Architecture that suggested the future had proceeded in directions I hadn't anticipated. Victor stood slowly, looking around with wonder. "We made it," he whispered. "After 43 years, we actually made it." I stood as well, my legs shaky but functional. We'd traveled 500 years in an instant, and we were alive, whole, present in a future we'd chosen but couldn't yet comprehend. Behind us, the pillar's light faded to its baseline glow. The transition was complete. We'd arrived. And in front of us, Walking toward our position through the transformed forest were three figures, humans or post-humans, I couldn't tell yet, approaching with evident purpose and what looked like carefully controlled curiosity. One of them called out in a language I didn't immediately recognize, though the translation technology they carried, devices that looked organic, possibly biological, quickly rendered their words comprehensible. "Welcome, travelers. We've been waiting. The archive predicted your arrival date to within 3 days. Please come with us. There are others who will want to meet the people from the ancient time, the ones who activated the waypoint and chose to journey forward." Victor looked at me, his expression mixing triumph and uncertainty. We'd succeeded in reaching the future, but now we had to figure out how to live in it. I picked up my equipment, shouldered my pack containing 500 years of obsolete technology and hopefully still relevant knowledge, and followed the figures into the forest. Somewhere behind us, separated by 5 centuries of linear time, but probably visible to instruments if anyone was still monitoring, the Trust was documenting the empty space where Section 14 had been, recording the absence, analyzing the void, trying to understand what had happened when impossible machinery had functioned exactly as designed. And ahead of us, in a future we'd chosen without understanding, lay everything that came next. The journey was one way, as Helena Voss had warned, but the destination would shape everything. We'd arrived. Now we had to discover what that meant.